Welcome everyone. Today is our fourth session in this workshop series on tax, trade and investment. We have discussed at the beginning the whole theoretical background to why it's necessary to discuss tax, trade and investment. The second one, we discussed about the digital trade and also reference to digital taxes. The third one was about dispute resolution from the Court of Justice of the European Union and the International Court of Justice, as well as the IDS settlement dispute resolution system, among others. And today we have tax incentives. And this topic of tax incentives, we have already addressed it before in the past together with Agustin on the other events that are also available online, have been recorded. But I think that today it gives a different perspective just because of the GLOBE and the minimum tax. So let me, my name is Irma Mosquera for the ones who do not know me yet. I'm associate professor at tax law at Leiden University, and I'm one of the co-organizers. And I will give the word now to Julian Chase. Please, Julian.
Hi, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Julian Chase, a law professor in Hong Kong. And I've been working with Irma and
Julian, you are in mute. You have.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Julian Chase. I'm a law professor in Hong Kong. I've been working on this project with Irma and Agustin for now a few months. And my work has been to focus on the increasing number of tax disputes and how non-tax tribunals have been dealing with these tax disputes, so including the WTO, the UN, and investment tribunals. So I wish you all a nice webinar.
Thank you so much, Julian. And I also will give the word to Hildegund. Just give it 1 second for her to join us. Hildegund, please go ahead. You can introduce yourself.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Hildegund Tybik Nordahl, and I am also with the CEP working with Agustin, and I was chairing a previous meeting on digital services taxes. So happy to join you and looking forward to the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you. And please remember that next week will be the final workshop series. That will be an all discussion panel. And we will have with policy makers and academics, and we will have Mario Jansen, that is Director of Trade and Agriculture from the OECD, Suranjali Tandon, Assistant Professor at National Institute of Public Finance in India, Howard Mann, who is also here attending today, an expert in international investment law and arbitration, Michael Leonard from the United Nations, and Corey Hiller from Senior Counsel from the IMF. So we welcome you also next week, at the same time, same Zoom link, and that will be the final session. Agustin, this is my role for today. I give the word to you.
Thanks a lot, Irma. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. So let me give you a bit of a short introduction to kind of the rationale of why we think this is an important meeting today. So we all know that in recent decades, we have experienced structural changes in the way of production, the way it is organized, and trade and investment, particularly through liberalization, together with technological developments, notably in transport, communications, but also other sectors, have substantially reduced trade and foreign investment costs and enabled global value chain supported by global finance to proliferate. So taxation in all that changing context or changing environment has been significantly affected by these changes. The debate around the taxation of the digital services, but as well the current negotiations in the context of minimum corporate income effective tax rates are cases in point. So against this backdrop, today's session seeks to shed some light into the interconnections of taxation, trade, investment, by specifically focusing on the use of tax incentives, as Irma said before. So why tax incentives? Well, tax incentives are a valid policy instrument, certainly used widely to pursue different goals, such as promoting investment, creating jobs, and ultimately boosting economic growth. Yet, tax incentives are costly, opaque, and based on the limited available information, can be highly redundant and hence ineffective in reaching these goals that I just mentioned. They're also distortive and can trigger undesired negative effects or externalities. So a big deal of the discussion today tries to focus really on understanding how these tax incentives should be designed to avoid all these negative aspects of them that I just mentioned. So rationalizing the use of tax incentives is vital. This is true in general, and it is particularly true now with the urgency triggered by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Governments simply cannot afford to lose revenues to ill-designed tax breaks, and this is crucial in today's event, ill-designed tax breaks, creating loopholes that contribute to the strategic tax planning and tax avoidance strategies, for instance, by multinationals, and hence hinder the fairness of international tax systems. They certainly cannot afford to maintain tax incentives that harm the environment and thus the sustainability of societies. So we really need to understand how the design of tax incentives, if they are being used, can be improved. So with this in mind, today's webinar will cover three main areas. First, Pasquale Pistoni, who is academic chairman with the International Bureau of Fiscal Documentation, IBFD, will give us a high-level discussion on tax incentives and international equity, which is, again, a crucial topic, for instance, in the context of the ongoing negotiations regarding the minimum CIT rate. We'll then move into the use of tax incentives as policy tool to promote investment. Hania Kronfol, who is private sector specialist with the microeconomics, trade and investment global practice with the World Bank, will give us an overview of the use of tax incentives to promote investment with a focus on developing economies. And Alexandra Redhead, who's lead tax and extractives with the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals and Sustainable Development, IGF, will bring a sectoral approach to the table by digging deeper into the use of tax incentives in the extractive or mining sector. Finally, we will also take a closer look at the use of tax incentives from a trade perspective. Simon Evenet, who's professor of international trade and economic development with the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, will discuss the use of tax incentives as trade barriers, a crucial topic today as well. And Liz Johnson, with head of investment law and policy with the Columbia Center of Sustainable Investment, will focus on tax incentives within investment treaties. She will really look into the use of tax incentives when it comes to tax and investment treaties. So we will first hear the introductory remarks by our 5 speakers. For that, we have 20 minutes allocated to each of you. So please, let's try to stick to those 20 minutes, followed by 10 minutes of Q&As. So I really encourage you to use the chat to leave questions, either for specific speakers or for the closing session that we'll have in the end, which will be set as a roundtable, a more dynamic setting, where I will try to ask questions to all participants or all speakers at the same time. And again, for that one, I will try to feed myself as much as possible from the chat. So do use the chat to leave Q&A session questions in there, please. So I will stop here and I will give the floor to Pasquale. Pasquale, please, the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Agustin.
Sorry, you are muted, Pasquale, I think.
Yes, now you should be able to hear me. So let me see if I can share the screen with my slides in slideshow mode. Yeah, that looks like it. And yes, thanks very much, Agustin, and thanks very much also to Irma and Julien for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here today and to discuss with you in this interdisciplinary context between tax, trade, and investment, some issues concerning, in particular, the cross-border problems connected with tax incentives. And the presentation reflects some of my interdisciplinary research done at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, besides the one that I do at IBFD. Now, I think that the outline tells you also something about myself. I am a lawyer, so and I am a tax lawyer. So I will put the emphasis on the importance to understand the technical context in which tax incentives operate, and also considering the legal constraints existing and potential developments related to the legal constraints. And for this reason, I will make difference between intended and unintended non-taxation, which is connected with incentives, and also put the emphasis on the so-called GLOBE proposal, or Pillar 2 of the BEPS 2.0 project for international tax coordination, which comes very close to what some people call the Biden plan, and also which has received the endorsement on the 5th of June 2021 by the G7. And I will then continue with some points that hopefully will raise discussion. Please understand that the focus will be on tax incentives and internation equity, as Agustin has mentioned. So I will try to see whether there is a future for tax incentives and what may be the critical issues that arise insofar as we try to crack tax avoidance, and at the same time, maybe we also crack something else. So I think that this is pretty much describing what I'm about to present. Now, the issue of tax incentives arises in connection with what is generally referred to as the regulatory purpose of taxation. And I want to stress the point that even if we consider that taxes are just for revenue collection goals, the regulatory purposes of taxation are a sort of essential function, one of the two main functions of the levying of taxes. At the end of the day, if we collect revenue and then we spend it for some purposes which could be related to environmental protection or economic growth, then an alternative way is also to do that by trying to nudge some behaviors and encourage, therefore, the desirable behaviors, or also discourage the undesirable behaviors. So we should consider that the regulatory purposes of taxation are one of the two main goals, and it's not that they are highly exceptional. And I think that this is something that we should stress, or at least this is my point of view. Now, I'm not getting into whether it is efficient or not efficient to do so, but I want to address the legal component. As I said, I am just a tax lawyer. So from my perspective, it is important that whenever we have a regulatory goal, then we deviate from equality, because some people or some behaviors are treated in a, let's say, with a tax incentive more favorable way than that could otherwise be. So whenever we pursue one of these goals, there must be, from a legal perspective, a sound constitutional justification, which can be, as I said, promotion of economic growth or protection of the environment, as well as many others. Bear in mind that if we speak about those issues from the perspective of the European Union, for those of us who are in the European Union, we have to take into account that when tax incentives are connected with business, we also have to comply with the supremacy of European Union law and the restrictions established in connection with the prohibition of state aids. Because whenever we have a preferential treatment as compared to the reference framework, there will be a potential selective tax advantage. Now, this is a very important moment to talk about tax incentives, because we all know that the economy has been badly affected by the COVID-19 crisis, not just the health of the people around the world, but also the economy. So I think that for us lawyers, we expect that the economists also propose an environment in which there may be deviations from what would normally be the role of taxation. And I put on the slide in a bit of a bold way, a massive use of tax incentives. Now, clearly, each country has different policies, and those different policies, can share one common goal, and that is being genuine tax policies, rather than policies connected with avoidance schemes or the other. So I make some kind of difference between what I call genuine tax incentives and incentives that to some extent are in borderline situations with potential tax avoidance or even aggressive tax planning friendly regimes. And this is easy to say in theory, but it's very difficult in practice because of the fact that each national sovereignty is separate, and each country can also try to attract more investment towards its territory. And this can go to the detriment of other countries. So it's really difficult in practice to draw from a legal perspective a dividing line between what is genuine and what is not. I'm trying not to use the word abusive because that brings us clearly into an area which is tax avoidance. So we want to try and see a genuine incentive given for a genuine goal and not possibly raising any issue of tax avoidance. What is the future for those tax incentives in cross-border scenarios? That's particularly important in my view because we have to understand that small countries may rely on cross-border situations more than big countries that may also affect trade among countries. So the focus, before getting into the so-called international equity, is also on the overall framework for tax incentives in cross-border situations. Now, there has been literature from an economic perspective that I'm not able to assess that indicated that tax incentives have a limited impact on foreign direct investment. And I want to stress that I have been doing interdisciplinary research with economics and business based at WU in Vienna for the past 15 years. And several years ago, we have come out with an analysis in a book which was published by IBFD, Tax, Treaties, Bridges Between Law and Economics. And from that perspective, we have also seen that the pre-BEPS environment, so a time in which there was no sufficient international tax coordination, in which there were no agreements on transparency with the so-called tax havens, and in which there were no strong rules on fighting against base erosion and profit shifting, that is all belonging to the past. I am not saying that multinational enterprises now pay their fair share of tax. I am saying that there are now legal agreements in force that allow countries to react in a sort of consistent way to those situations in which multinational enterprises set up structures which are, in fact, forms of tax avoidance or tools for promoting tax avoidance. So we need to consider that in the past, any single treaty could allow to have income flowing out of the country of source, perhaps without a considerable tax burden. And right now, there are much sharper rules, I would say, in order to counter base erosion and profit shifting, and tax authorities cooperate with each other for that purpose. Now, the problem is still that in the so-called BEPS 2.0 environment, we need to understand what can be done in order to, give countries the right to exercise their taxing powers and also take into account, the competition, the tax competition among the countries, and also understanding what is the relation between a tax incentive and tax competition and the measures that want to limit the so-called harmful tax competition. Now, tax competition is in general good, just like competition for everyone is, but some regulatory framework may be also desirable, and it is not for a lawyer to discuss about it, because this is something which, in my view, also is more complex to address. But the point in my presentation is here that when a country decides to give a so-called genuine tax incentive, then that country pursues a regulatory goal which is important for the priorities of that country, which can be economic growth. I'm not saying that, just like Machiavelli, that when we have a goal, the goal justifies the means. But I am saying that when there is such a goal, we should at least make some kind of deeper analysis in order to see what is the potential impact of measures against tax avoidance. And one of them is related to the fact that if tax incentives bring taxation down to low levels or zero taxation, whether the other country, as it seems to be the case, may compensate that low taxation. Now, this brings me to say that for me, we should differentiate situations in which there is some form of intended non-taxation from forms of unintended non-taxation. Now, in a purely domestic scenario, this is rather easy, because in a purely domestic scenario, we have a policy decision, tax policy decision by a country, and this country simply reduces taxes. But in cross-border situations, the point is that the measures countering harmful tax competition could catch in the net also fish that is not supposed to be caught in the net. And that is what may be related to the so-called genuine incentives. And I want to say that the dividing line is very thin between what is intended non-taxation and what is unintended unintended non-taxation. In cross-border relations, what one country can regard as intended non-taxation can be regarded by the other country as unintended non-taxation, or anyway, non-taxation. And therefore we can say, well, if there is non-taxation, then some of the measures that are being discussed, such as the establishment of a global minimum corporate tax rate, I will refer to that in general as GLOBE, allow this other country to question the incentive that has been given by the one country, and therefore try also to compensate for that taxation, because that's also what is possible under the GLOBE project. And therefore, I think that we need to discuss this, and we need to understand that the right to counter or prevent a race to the bottom in terms of tax competition, how much, in how far can this allow countries to operate and apply compensatory measures? And I put it very provocatively at the bottom part of the slide. There is an issue of the countries to, countries have their policy, and they also should have the right to remain the masters of that policy. Plus, we have an additional issue, and that is that if one country makes a sacrifice and the other country actually compensates for that low taxation and gets more taxes out of that, then there is also the issue as to the equity in the relations between the two countries. And those issues can be even more complicated in the presence of a tax treaty, as I will say in a few minutes. Now, this brings us to say that, there is this proposal which has received an endorsement a few weeks ago, possibly with bringing a corporate income tax at of 15% min rate. But then, it's not really entirely clear whether this, how this applies to non-harmful practices or non-abusive practices. Now, we're not talking about measures that counter abusive practices. When I say abusive, I mean tax avoidance. And for the economists, sometimes you bring together tax avoidance and tax evasion, but essentially not paying taxes that were due, and there has been a circumvention. This is the perspective of the lawyers. Here we are talking about measures that prevent the race to the bottom. So prevent tax avoidance from arising and allow the other country to either top up tax or to give relief for double taxation, changing the method from exemption to credit. So it's not really clear how GLOBE may concretely operate. And I want to make the point that in particular for the least developed countries, this may be rather problematic. If I can invest in a in a country with strong infrastructures and a system, everything that works, and then at the end of the day, there is the same rate of tax, why bother investing in a country that has bad road networks, and perhaps it's really difficult to work? Then you can say still, you can get cheaper labor there. But the point is also that if that country makes a sacrifice in order to promote a genuine economic growth, which can constitute the priority for a policy, from a policy perspective, we should try to understand that the global fight against multinational enterprises not paying their fair share of taxes should not produce spillover effects or overkill effects. Now, let me go to this point in particular. The issue is, we are talking about the fact that GLOBE can affect the right of the country, the sovereignty of the country, not to exercise their taxing jurisdiction. And correspondingly, it can expand the jurisdiction to tax of a country that otherwise would not have what we call a genuine tax nexus. With Juliane Kokot, we are going to address, I know that she was with you last week, we're going to address this in the second phase of the International Law Association project, which will cover tax nexus. But these are issues which can become already very critical if in a tax treaty we have the so-called tax sparing clauses. I am not here to discuss whether tax sparing clauses are desirable, undesirable, or whatever. There's been a debate which has gone on for long. What I want to say here, as a fact, as a tax lawyer, tax sparing clauses are there. And when you have a tax sparing clauses in a tax treaty, then that is a form of bilaterally agreed, intended tolerance of the jurisdiction not to tax. So it's a sort of agreed form of intended non-taxation. So this is something which, in my view, will have to be addressed, because if on the one hand we say in the tax treaties that we tolerate that, and on the other hand, through unilateral measures, we override this, then I think that this is something which, in my view, from a legal perspective, should be discussed. I'm not saying that in tax law matters there is no treaty override. You know, we have countries which are champions of this. But still, I think that these are issues that we need to discuss between lawyers and economists, and in a context of tax, trade, and investment, which are becoming closer and closer in the actual practice. So is it fair country for pursuing general goals, incentive, and then the other country, which would otherwise not have a tax nexus, actually compensates those taxes? Well, we don't have this situation in a domestic context, because in a domestic context, if there is a country and that country can decide to lower taxes, that country will clearly not compensate that lower taxation. No one can question that a country on its own territory is restricted in its tax sovereignty. So what it can generate is what I call hidden tax protectionism. I'm trying to use a language also that can be attractive to people from trade and investment, because when you think about whether to invest domestically or to invest abroad, if you invest abroad, you can lose the lower taxes. If you invest domestically, no problem. So big countries, big capital exporters will in fact have an indirect advantage. I know that this is extremely complex, and I am not criticizing Globe. I am saying that Globe goes in the right direction, but I think, as I have been writing in my academic research, I think that we should thoroughly discuss all the issues that arise, including the ones which arise from the lack of coordination of income with turnover taxation. Because we're now in a context in which, instead of solving the problem, the cross-border problems of income taxation, we allow countries to levy digital services tax more and more. I'm not saying that that's bad. I'm just saying that it's a fact. I'm saying that we can have a very bad situation in which there is a digital service tax which is levied in a country, and then the other country also compensates lower taxation for corporate income purposes. That's very problematic. I am against carve-outs, because carve-outs are often the kingdom of lobbies. And I'm not saying that we should be against lobbies. I think that, from an academic perspective, we should have, some goals and try also to enforce them consistently in a possible neutral way. And here is my final point, because I am already reaching the end of my presentation. I think I have 1 more minute. I think that international tax coordination is desirable to pursue global fair taxation, so getting enterprises to pay their fair share of tax. But we have to understand that the global goals have to be reconciled also with the goals of countries, and I would say with the legitimate aspiration of countries to put economic growth on top of their priorities. And that's particularly important for the least developed countries. After all, if we look at international agreements, I'm not only referring to the ones which have tax-sparing clauses, but I'm also referring about the TRIPS. For instance, Article 66 to TRIPS includes, makes a reference to tax incentive for promoting the transfer of technologies. So if we really have to discuss about a potential carve-out, it should be just for the least developed countries, and then perhaps it could be useful to develop some kind of international standards for genuine tax incentives. So in other words, what is sound from a perspective of a tax incentive, which could be measures for economic development or environmental protection, and then establish some form of global strict enforcement, because that is what also preserves competitions against the so-called sweetheart deals or the like. That's pretty much all from me. And yes, back to you, Agustin.
Thank you very much, Pasquale, and thanks a lot for sticking to time. Very much appreciated. This was very interesting as an opening remarks for today. You mentioned a few times in the beginning what you call regulatory goals, which, if I got it right, it's very similar to the stated goals or stated objectives, tax incentives. And you say, and rightfully so, I think, that this is crucial in this discussion, as long as governments pursue regulatory goals that can be climate change or economic growth. Then my question is, how can the civil society or taxpayers or even governments themselves or even supranational organizations, international organizations, be sure that the stated goals or regulatory goals are indeed the only ones behind the implementation of the tax incentive? And there are not other goals such as eroding tax bases of competitors or other goals that are obviously not disclosed. So I think it is an important discussion. My question is, in reality, should we really consider that the disclosed stated goals are the only ones that matter and that's enough as a justification, or are there players out there that should really try to understand where this makes sense or not?
Yeah. Thank you, Agustin. I think that we have two problems. One is setting the standard of what can be desirable and what can be acceptable. Another one is enforcing it. And there are two extremely difficult problems to address. Now, the first one requires some kind of, I think that also research and interdisciplinary research can show, how we can try to reconcile that. Because, if you say that you have a small country, which is, for instance, let's say, giving a preventive relief for economic double taxation within groups of multinational enterprises, and that is done on the basis of excess profit rulings. And then you can have that situation in which the schedular nature of that ex-ante relief doesn't take care of what happens in the other country. So in other words, in the worst case scenario, you solve the problem of economic double taxation. In the best case scenario, you get an advantage. So that is a situation in which a legitimate goal, which is doing something about economic double taxation, is pursued in a way that, in fact, it is very difficult to see whether that's acceptable or not. In the European Union, it's very easy, because I want to say that we have a competition policy, and the European Commission is doing that under the scrutiny of the Court of Justice. Worldwide, it's more difficult, because we have this constant problem with WTO and direct taxes. I shouldn't say too much outside of the field of taxes, but still, the problem is that, in fact, we have seen that the competition between Europe and the United States has, takes place for long, and the reaction takes a decade, and then there is, an assessment of the fact that one country or party has violated the rules, and then we have, we start another phase. So somehow, I think we need to establish some standards in terms of what is sound policy. This is the era of soft law, Agustin, and soft law can be more powerful, because in a way, if we show that something is a good practice, then countries can voluntarily adopt that. So in other words, I wouldn't exclude that if countries are so keen to counter tax avoidance, they may be also willing to accept that there are situations, instead of doing carve-outs, Agustin, we can say, well, that's okay. And then the problem is, how can we enforce that? And that's something on which I have no answer, Agustin.
It's a good answer, though, to the question already. So, but yeah, so my follow-up question would be, so this is not only about the design. I understand, as you, Pasquale, mentioned, you're a tax lawyer, you're interested in that part of the story. But then my follow-up question, and a bit biased as an economist, would be, how can we assess whether those stated goals or regulatory goals are indeed reached by these policies, right? And that's probably something that Hania and probably Alexandra will really focus the presentation on, about how effective these are in the end, right? I don't know if you want to comment on that, on this, Pasquale.
Yeah, I want to say, Agustin, that what I've seen in Europe is that some countries put some justifications, And then, in fact, there is those justification or goals are not proportionate. So the measures are not proportionate. So they say something, but in fact, that just, I don't want to say an excuse because I'm being recorded, and so that might be too unfriendly. But you know, the point is still that some are the official goals and some others are the real ones. So that's extremely difficult because we need to, you know, we are making progress with international tax coordination. And we have seen that international coordination can really crack tax avoidance. But now time has come also to think that if we really want to protect tax sovereignty, we need to share a part of the tax sovereignty, in particular for technical matters, we need to share it at the global level, because that is the only way in which we can preserve some reasonably sound environment for competition. And also, I want to say, if we kill business, there will be nothing left. So we don't have just to pursue some goals and forget about the others. Business creates wealth, and we should preserve that across the globe.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Pasquale. So this gives us a nice and smooth transition into our next speaker. Pasquale will take it up in the end in the roundtable. I'm sure there will be a lot of more policy-oriented questions in the end. So happy to bring you back then. So Hania, now we will hear about the use of tax incentives for investment from you. Please. So you are still muted. We can see your slides, but you are still muted.
No worries, I was just setting up the screen. Thank you so much, Agustin, and thank you so much, Pasquale, for that excellent introductory presentation. It leads actually very nicely into this discussion. Today, I'll be discussing corporate tax incentives in the context of FDI. Sorry, one second. Let me just set up my slideshow slightly differently. It's not quite working here. Here we go. So I'll discuss four main topics today. I'll start by talking about key conceptual frameworks as they relate to incentives in FDI. Then I'll touch precisely on this literature and evidence about the role of tax incentives in influencing investor decisions that was kind of brought up earlier today. Third, I'll speak to international good practices in the design and administration of incentives. And finally, we'll conclude with emerging policy questions and recommendations. In contrast to Pasquale, probably from this agenda, you can see that I'm not a lawyer. I'm a policy specialist and really focused from a practitioner's perspective in terms of helping implement reforms in developing countries. So the first thing that I wanted to start off with is that a core principle when we talk about FDI policy is that investment is not a one-off transaction, right? It really should be conceived as a relationship between the host government and investors. So here we depict this as a kind of an investment life cycle. It begins with a broader umbrella national strategy to attract and retain FDI, and then continues to the policies and promotion measures to attract FDI into the host country, which includes incentives. Then we have policies related to investment entry and establishment, investment retention and expansion, and finally, FDI linkages and spillovers that roots FDI in the host economy. What we find is all too often governments around the world focus on this earlier stage of investment attraction, while this is only one small part of the puzzle. Many benefits come later on in the relationship as foreign firms bring in capital, employ local staff, promote exports, and share technology and know-how. So the question that we face today and that policymakers face in this context is what's the right policy mix to attract the type and the quality of FDI the country is seeking, which includes incentives, but other aspects like the business regulatory environment, investment establishment and legal protections, and other variables. So when we think about tax incentives in FDI, the point I want to make is that we need to think of them as an integrated part of this broader investment policy and promotion framework. Now, honing in on tax incentives, there are four key challenges or balancing acts that we can kind of pose that policymakers face, and we see have been accentuated by the COVID-19 pandemic. The first is perhaps the most fundamental, is that the pandemic introduced unprecedented challenges to domestic revenue mobilization, while businesses were struggling with income and cash flow constraints. And so essentially it presented a dual challenge to revenue systems for providing relief for effective taxpayers and simultaneously managing a sudden large drop in revenue collections. The second policy challenge is really about the timing of support, how to manage the call for short-term temporary measures to businesses versus long-term options. And the third speaks to a commonplace challenge in the development storyline, right? It involves balancing this drive for growth, which in the case of incentives is often tied to cost savings, with other goals for sustainable and equitable growth, like those related to environmental protection. Finally, and very relevant today, policymakers will need to balance a desire for unilateral versus multilateral efforts. You know, obviously countries will want to act in a way that bolsters their own competitiveness vis-a-vis other countries, but we know there's this growing understanding of the harmful effects of tax incentives competition by perpetuating a race to the bottom, and other global challenges that Pasquale went into some more detail around tax evasion and profit shifting that really require multilateral efforts to address. I mean, if we look at the last 40 years, statutory corporate tax rates have continuously fallen as countries compete to attract private investment. In the 1980s, the worldwide average statutory corporate tax rate was around 40% as compared to around 24% in 2020. Additionally, we've seen the number of tax havens has risen. So, right, as now the need for domestic revenue mobilization has become more dire, the pandemic is in fact raising political pressure on governments to address kind of the two key global challenges that form Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 of the OECD G20 inclusive framework on base erosion and profit sharing, and profit shifting. Some of these have already been discussed, but obviously Pillar 1 addresses a reallocation of taxing rights for certain digital products. And Pillar 2 is the one that we'll focus on a bit more through the discussion today, is around the introduction of a global corporate minimum tax. So what's happening around the globe? We see that, in fact, there's really a strong proliferation of incentives globally as policymakers use it as an instrument to attract FDI and also to influence the behaviors of firms, right? So as you can see from this chart, between 2009 and 2015, out of 155 countries, almost half, 46% of them adopted new corporate tax measures or made existing ones more generous. Now, if we look at kind of the opposing measure, less than 25% went the other direction, opting to eliminate incentives or make them less generous. And this holds true for almost all regions and countries across income levels. As of 2015, out of 107 developing countries, more than half were granting tax holidays or preferential corporate tax rates across sectors at the national level. Now, this growing popularity of corporate tax incentives derives partly from increased competition to attract FDI. Policymakers are driven to match or even surpass their regional neighbors by offering more generous concessions. Now, what's interesting is that although the use of incentives is widespread, the empirical evidence actually demonstrates that the role of tax incentives in influencing investor behavior is generally quite limited. If I were to summarize, the key takeaway is that incentives can strengthen the investor location, or what we call the country's value proposition, but it can't compensate for a weak one. So a low tax burden cannot compensate really for a weak or unattractive FDI environment. And we find this being reported in the literature, as well as many studies that look at investor surveys, as well as econometric analyses. That said, for suitable locations, incentives can play a role in the final stages of the site selection process. So when investors are deciding on shortlisted locations and are waving between similar options, incentives can kind of tip them over the edge. What we find is that the success of incentives in attracting FDI depends strongly on country level characteristics, unsurprisingly, right? So tax incentives are actually more effective in countries that have better infrastructure, reasonable transport costs, and a policy framework favoring investment. Research from the World Bank actually shows that incentives are 8 times more effective in attracting FDI in countries with good investment climates. Other country-level characteristics such as political stability, regulatory quality, and market opportunities are found to be more critical in investor decision-making. So here in this chart, we see the results from the Global Investment Competitiveness Report carried out by our investment climate team at the bank, which includes responses from over 750 international business executives carried out between February and June of 2017 that were involved in the operations of multinational corporations in developing countries. You can see that it reflects the consensus from the literature and other analytics that macroeconomic, market, investment climate factors trump as priorities for investors when considering investment decisions. In terms of investment climate, political stability, along with a stable legal and regulatory environment, are key considerations for investors. Now, a key risk or challenge around tax incentives policy to attract FDI is their cost, right? So they can be incredibly costly to governments, particularly in developing nations that already are struggling with their fiscal constraints. What we call kind of foregone tax revenue from the reduction in firms' tax liability, which is also known as tax expenditures, can impose significant physical loss. And this cost is most burdensome for lower income countries. And many times in these lower income countries, we find that the cost of tax incentives are hidden because they're not well estimated and they're not well represented in national budgets. That said, policymakers, especially in developing countries who advocate for their use, often justify the cost. They'll say, by using these incentives, by using this money, we'll get more investment, more spillovers, and in turn, this new investment in capital can increase tax revenue. But in fact, as illustrated here at the global level, we found that there's a strong negative relationship between the generosity of corporate tax incentives in the country and their corporate tax revenue as a share of GDP. For each 10% percentage point increase in corporate tax incentives, tax revenue goes down by around 0.35% of GDP. Another concern related to the use of tax incentives to attract FDI is the effect on domestic investment, which may be displaced and reduces the net impact of the incentive on the domestic capital stock. This happens, for example, if FDI reflects a mere transfer of ownership through mergers and acquisitions, or if domestic investment is round-trip through a foreign entity to take advantage of the tax incentive. Now, Augustine set up this slide very well. The key question becomes, how can developing economies design and implement incentives strategically in a manner that maximizes their value for money and minimizes the risk? And here we have a few key good practices or guidelines. First, use tax incentives sparingly to achieve a clearly defined policy purpose. When working in developing countries, we find that many policymakers will say, the objective of this incentive is to attract FDI. But as we all know, FDI is really a vehicle towards an end. Is the primary objective to create more jobs, higher value-added jobs, promote the absorption of foreign technology, or diversify the economy through investment in new sectors? It needs to have a very specific policy objective. And once that objective is articulated, policymakers should identify the underlying barriers and market failures and evaluate if indeed the tax incentive is an effective way of addressing this barrier. In many cases, it may not be, and there may be other policy measures to use that money. And there may be other tax policy measures that have to be implemented in tandem with the tax incentive. Second, target investors strategically. So policymakers first need to prioritize, like I mentioned in an earlier slide, the type and quality of FDI they seek to attract, and then identify the subset of investors that are most responsive to incentives. Developing cost-efficient incentive schemes largely rests on identifying which types of investors ultimately decide to invest in one country over another because of the tax incentive. This is known as the marginal investor. And a couple of considerations are helpful in this regard. First, globally, evidence suggests that incentives are most influential in attracting efficiency-seeking FDI, which is export-oriented, since investors are mainly driven by competitive cost advantages in host countries. This is in contrast to natural resource or market-seeking FDI, in which in many cases we find that investors will likely come anyway. So it'll be interesting to hear the presentation on the extractive sectors in this regard. Second, we want a scenario where the net benefits from FDI that are incurred for marginal investors exceed the costs from the redundant investors. Now, estimating the costs and benefits is a tricky endeavor when it comes to the effect of FDI locational decisions, because we don't have a clear counterfactual. So one approach that we use is to look at the returns of investment at firms. And this relies on the premise that tax incentives are considered effective if they allow a company to become profitable when they would have otherwise been unprofitable without the tax incentive. So we kind of look at the ROI with the incentive and without the incentive, and we identify those as marginal that have shifted from being below a certain hurdle rate to above a certain hurdle rate because of the incentive. A third good practice is to directly link incentives to defined policy objectives. Developing countries in particular rely on profit-based tax incentives, such as tax holidays and corporate income tax reductions. These instruments generally do not result in cost-efficient outcomes, as they confer a blanket benefit often based on an upfront granting mechanism rather than the actual performance of firms. Instead, governments should consider shifting to merit-based incentive instruments like allowances and accelerated depreciation. Fourth, incentives need to be rigorously monitored and evaluated in terms of the costs and benefits. An ex-ante analysis paired with a strong M&E framework during and post-implementation would be a critical endeavor. A key input into this cost benefits and monitoring and evaluation system is an estimation of tax expenditure. As mentioned earlier, these data paired with information on the targeted incomes and the responsiveness of investors can help reveal precisely how the costs compare to the benefits and inform whether the incentive needs to be revised or phased out. Fifth, ensure a clear exit policy with sunset provisions and safeguards to avoid abuses and leakages to the system. Finally, promote transparency and rule-based administration. So when implementing incentives policy, institutional coordination, bureaucratic effectiveness, and transparency matter, right? Not only to sustain accessible and streamlined systems, but also to reduce the opportunities for discretion and to ensure a level playing field for firms. Information on tax incentives should be made publicly available and tax expenditure estimates incorporated in the budgetary process. So now I'll talk very briefly on this global minimum tax, and the reality is I'm perhaps posing more questions than I will have answers to. We know that tax competition has been one of the main drivers of the fall in CIT rates, keeping corporate collections nearly flat, even while personal income tax and indirect tax collections have increased. The establishment of the global minimum corporate tax, or GLOBE, that was introduced earlier raises really new questions on the role of incentives in driving foreign direct investment. And while multilateral efforts to address tax competition is a lauded initiative, it is still very early in this process with many details to be ironed out before being able to consider the implications in a substantive way. At the extreme, could this minimum tax, could it signal the end of the role of tax incentives? With discussions focused on a 15% rate and given alternative avenues, chances are incentives will continue to play some role, at least in the short term, as a policy instrument to attract FDI. That said, a global minimum tax regime will dilute the latitude of corporate tax incentives as a cost-saving advantage to M&Es and may have revenues shift to other jurisdictions. So we need to consider how will minimum tax influence FDI location decisions for different countries at different income levels and different economic structures. On the one hand, as discussed today, we see the highest redundancy rates associated with incentives in developing countries. So if policymakers rely less on tax incentives, particularly tax holidays, which are most pervasive in the developing world, this could potentially lead to better net benefits to the host economy from foreign presence. Also, if we see a phasing out of tax incentives, perhaps policymakers will use other tools that could really bolster the competitiveness of the country. On the other hand, if higher income countries shift to other forms of incentives like direct subsidies, this could leave developing countries with fewer levers to compete and lead to broader inequality. I'll stop there because there are many other questions. I know there was also discussions about SEZs, which are widely used in the developing world as a feature to attract FDI. Again, the question is, will they shift and focus again on regulatory aspects, or will this lead to investors closing up shop and moving elsewhere? And of course, then there's a broader question about what this means for tax coordination and harmonization down the line. So I'll close now with just kind of a few key policy recommendations. And what we say is kind of, we have the spotlight now on tax policy. So there's space for policymakers, especially in the developing world, to move on much needed reforms in the space of tax incentives policy. First, there's an opportunity to revisit incentive policy through an evidence-based approach. This means streamlining incentives, eliminating redundant ones, improving targeting, and raising cost effectiveness. Second, we push for this in a lot of developing countries because it's a good first step. Just improve transparency in administration. This involves publishing tax expenditures, emphasizing monitoring and compliance, and capitalizing on e-digitalization trends to automate procedures. Third, focus incentives on sustainable agendas and public goods. There is this political momentum to innovate and compete on skills. We see a lot of discussion around green initiatives and R&D. So if we're going to consider incentives, let's consider them in that context. That said, they're still tricky to implement with targeted objectives like these. Finally, ride the current momentum to foster international cooperation on incentives policy, whether it be through this move on a global minimum tax or other efforts. This endeavor to consider multilateral efforts to curtail tax competition and tax evasion remains critical. I'll stop there, but I'm very happy to take any questions as they come up.
Thank you very much, Hanya. I think I muted without wanting, sorry. Thanks a lot. Very nice and clear presentation. So let me come up with two quick follow-ups. So you mentioned that a clear definition of the policy objective is crucial to move into, for instance, evidence-based policymaking, which I totally agree. But what we observe out there is a striking lack of transparency. The GTA, the Global Tax Expenditures Database that CEP and the German Development Institute recently launched, has data on more than 20,000 individual tax expenditure provisions. And to be, for the sake of honesty, this is not only about tax incentives for investment, it's tax expenditures in general, but I think it still applies. And what we find is that more than 2/3 of all provisions do not provide revenue foregone estimates with the information on the policy objective that the measure is pursuing. 2/3 is quite a lot. And so my question is, I totally agree with you, but in the real life, in the real world, how can governments even try or seek to come up with evidence-based policymaking if they don't know themselves which is exactly the policy they are pursuing through the implementation of tax incentives? And you know, it sounds a bit like a simplifying question, but it's crucial. And both you, Pasquale, and Hanya were very, both of you stressed how important the policy goal behind the tax incentive is, right? Both in the design and also in the implementation of it. But if governments have or do not disclose that information, it's just very difficult to get there.
No, this is a great comment and a great question, Agustin. I mean, that's fundamentally the problem, right? Is that as I go to developing countries and even many emerging economies that are more advanced, we see that incentives are used as a knee-jerk reaction, right? So we want incentives because they're going to attract FDI, and that's kind of the objective, where we think that it will be good for jobs. But they don't start off with this question of, is the incentive the right instrument? It's like they haven't defined the problem to define the solution. And so that needs to be fundamentally revisited. That said, what do? We enter a lot of these countries, and like you said, Agustin, we don't have a good idea of what the objective is. Generally, we hear, like I mentioned in my presentation, we want to promote investment. So there, we do some basic cost-benefit analyses to look at common goals that many developing countries pursue. In many cases, it's jobs. So how does it relate to the creation of jobs? If we have more data, we could say something like high value added jobs. Another key policy objective is export promotion. How does it relate to export promotion? So we use kind of generic markers to pit the tax expenditures against these objectives. And sometimes even just a simple analysis, Augustine, like we'll just look at where is the money going to which sectors, which types of investors, and where are the jobs, and there's a mismatch. So a lot of the incentives will maybe go to natural resource seeking FDI that would have probably come in anyway, or they go to sectors that don't create a high level of jobs. And that's the primary objective because there's a youth bulge or some other development challenge that they're facing. So I think you pinned it right on the nail, right? The problem is they're developing solutions without knowing the problem. And so in that case, the first step is at least just see if is it creating jobs, right? Is it creating some sort of investment? Is it promoting exports? But really then step back and ask, are you using the right instrument?
Thanks, Hanya. And because you mentioned already some technicalities on how you actually try to measure this missing data somehow, let me follow up on that one. When you mentioned your presentation that I think you try to understand whether a tax incentive is effective or not, if it affects in the margin, whether the business moves from non-profitable to profitable, right? If I got you right. Why is that we or you follow this dichotomic differentiation from non-profitable to profitable, but you don't capture a continuous impact of that on that variable? Am I clear there? So we would like to see whether the tax incentive also has an impact on a profitable firm by increasing profits, right? Not just moving from non-profitable to profitable. Is that a technical reason? Why is that the case?
No, that's a good question. So we have to be very creative in terms of identifying a marginal investor when it comes to FDI location decisions, right? Because the ones that didn't come are not in the country, so we don't have any data, right? So one of the ways that we can look at it is, would it have been a viable investment without the incentive? And so it kind of looks at the least, it takes the most conservative numbers. Because if it was not viable without the incentive and then became viable with the incentive, we know we can call that a marginal investors. Yes, there are some companies that were profitable and achieved higher levels of profitability, but then you could argue that they may have come in anyway. Of course, that it doesn't take into account that they might have achieved even higher levels of profitability in other countries, and how does tax competition weigh into that. But it's just a first cut, because actually making these calculations is very hard. And in a minute, I'll share a paper that we wrote on this to look at different estimates. But the short answer to your question is that it creates kind of the most conservative marker for identifying the marginal investor, one that wouldn't have made it had it not been for the incentive.
Okay, got it. Thanks. I think Irma, you have a question?
Yes. My question, since we are discussing about tax, trade, and investment, one of the things that has been also raised by investment law is about the performance requirements, and whether you could have a tax incentive that also has these performance requirements to create more jobs and so forth. So the question is, how do you see that for developing countries?
Yep, so we also do a lot of work on performance requirements, and for the most part, we find that performance requirements can be a huge impediment to FDI, particularly in developing countries. We understand the need for them, right? So developing countries are saying we want to benefit the most from these investors, but because they're already struggling to attract FDI, performance requirements create kind of new challenges for those investors. So instead, one way around that is precisely kind of to use incentives, right? And say, tie an incentive directly to the performance requirement or the merit that you're trying to see from the investor. So if it's, for example, R&D, you can tie the incentive directly to R&D expenditures. Or if it's jobs, create an allowance around jobs. That's the way that we would look at it.
Okay, thanks, Hanya. And we have one more from Hildegund, please.
Yes, so it's in relation to this issue about the trade side of investment and taxes and trade. So in international trade agreements, you typically have provisions like you should not have economic needs tests to let the foreign investors in, and these relate precisely to the issue of creating jobs or exports or sourcing locally and these kind of things, where you have disciplines on these kind of policies in international trade agreements and also in the GATT. So how do you see these kind of
Another very, very good question. So we see this a lot in developing countries. There are like these case-by-case incentives, and they also come a lot in the context of tax holidays, right? So whether to decide to give a tax holiday, they do this ex ante review of the investment. And the good practice really is to first of all push away from tax holidays, like I mentioned, and instead to move to objective criteria that is automatic. And so then when investors are filling out their taxes, they just claim the incentive based on objective criteria. So we really kind of push countries, developing countries in particular, to shift away from case-by-case incentives that are discretionary, and instead use an automatic system of tax incentives that are tied to specific expenditures or costs or other performance-based criteria that they can just file in their tax reports. And then obviously there can be compliance measures afterwards based on risk auditing measures in that.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Hania, and thanks for the questions. So we'll take it up in the end in the roundtable with you, Hania, again, but let's move directly into Lee's presentation. So Liz Johnson is here. Couldn't see you yet. Yeah, you're there.
Yep,
Great.
Sorry, hi.
No worries.
Let me grab my
Good to have you.
slides. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to pull these up and play from start. And I am glad that I'm just following that last presentation, which is really terrific. And I feel like a lot of the themes that I wanted to talk about kind of pick up on what you had just presented. So I want to talk about investment treaties and investment incentives, looking at some of the connections. And here's an outline of the topics that I wanted to cover. But I think the two main things are investment treaties as incentives and investment treaties and incentives. So two different dimensions of that relationship. And then highlight maybe some open questions, special timely issues, and think about some potential reforms. So first, to start with the issue of investment treaties as incentives. I don't know how many people are familiar with investment treaties, because I think this is a very interdisciplinary audience. So just to recap very briefly, investment treaties, often referred to as international investment agreements or IIAs, or bilateral investment treaties, are agreements between countries or among groups of countries regarding the protection of foreign investment. And they are typically accompanied by, they typically include provisions on investor-state dispute settlement, where the company can sue its host government in arbitration. So the theory behind international investment agreements is that they provide these enhanced protections to foreign investment, and that enhanced protection will in turn promote investment. And then the country, particularly the host country, but also the home country, will also benefit from that increased investment. So you can see them as types of regulatory incentives, or that's the aim of them, in order to kind of increase FDI. But over the past several decades, there have been an increasing number of studies looking at, whether they work, whether they are efficiently well-designed incentives, doing the same type of cost-benefit analysis that you might do for other types of incentives programs. And on the location dimension of whether or not they're actually influencing decisions by investors of where to invest, whether to invest and where, that evidence is lacking. There have been a multitude of studies, including meta-studies of the multitude of studies, that find that there is no clear or conclusive evidence that investment treaties are influencing investors' investment decisions in terms of where they go. I think there's also a growing amount of literature looking at the influence, though, on behavior and outcomes. So that, as Hania just said, we don't just want FDI for FDI's sake. We want investment because we want the positive outcomes that it can generate. And I think in this context, it's actually having potentially some undesirable effects. One is that it may be creating complex corporate structures, which makes things like tax administration, illicit financial flows, those types of concerns more difficult to identify, address, regulate. And that is because companies will structure themselves in order to get the protections of the investment treaties. So you can have these complex corporate structures that arise as a result. Another issue is that they may be creating moral hazard. So for instance, if you think about an investor in a new natural gas project, a risk-averse investor might say, I'm not sure about investing in natural gas at the moment. There are potential restrictions, taxes, et cetera, as we move to a no carbon economy that will make that investment not so likely. If you think about, however, having the protection of, or sorry, that investment more costly, but if you think about then the protections of international investment agreements, potentially giving you compensation for government measures, stranding those assets, then that reduces the risk of that investment and can make it more attractive. It may also be creating incentives for collusion, and I'll talk about that with respect to the issue of incentives and how they are agreed and some are kind of the opposite of best practices that you might be seeing. And they can be hindering public interest regulation. So we know that often investments are neither necessarily good nor necessarily bad. The outcomes depend on how the investments are regulated. And one concern about international investment agreements is that they are hindering government's abilities and willingness to regulate in the public interest to address environmental, social, economic, or other issues. So those are some of the connections very briefly between, I think, investment incentives, viewing treaties as investment incentives and how that might influence the location of the investments, but also the behavior of those investments. But moving on, and this is what I wanted to focus more on, is how investment treaties are actually treating incentives. So there have been many cases recently relating to investment incentives, and they typically relate to the withdrawal or the modification of incentive schemes. These might be fiscal incentives, financial incentives, or regulatory incentives. Dozens of cases have been brought against Spain and Italy alone relating to modifications of incentive schemes. So what are the legal claims that are brought under the IIAs, under the investment treaties? One is, it's frequently, I think most frequently, whether the modification or removal of the incentive scheme violates the fair and equitable treatment provision of treaties. It's a commonly included provision, and this provision has been interpreted to protect investors' legitimate expectations, to require proportionate conduct from the state, and to provide investments and investors a measure of stability and predictability. Another common claim has been that modification of the investment incentive scheme constitute an indirect expropriation of the investor's investment. So it has effectively taken that investment. Those claims are less likely to succeed generally because the threshold for an expropriation is higher than the threshold for a fair and equitable treatment breach. Some of these legal claims are affected and limited by carve-outs in certain treaties that will say taxation measures are not actionable under the treaty. So that has limited tribunals' review of some incentives schemes and modifications of those schemes. But we've still seen, as I said, kind of dozens of cases on these issues. I also wanted to highlight that investment incentives have come into play in other areas, apart from claims addressing the modification or withdrawal of the scheme. So one recent case is TCC versus Pakistan, where it was an extractive industry investor that had sought very favorable fiscal and other terms in its contract with the government. Ultimately, the government was not willing to provide those terms, but when the project failed, the investor sued, and the investor won against Pakistan. The tribunal actually awarded damages on the basis that the investor had secured the investment incentives that it sought. So in short, the investor wanted investment incentives in the contract. It wasn't able to get those investment incentives. Nevertheless, when the tribunal awarded damages, it awarded damages based on the assumption that the incentives would have been granted. And the damages wound up in, it was over $4 billion award plus attorney's fees and interest. So now it's up around $6 billion in damages. So it's a huge award. Let me see, sorry, next slide. So in response to some of the cases, particularly against the EU member states that have been used to challenge the withdrawal or the modification of incentive schemes, the EU has taken steps to minimize the risk, I think, of such claims in some of its more recent investment agreements. I think one reason also why the EU and its member states are particularly attuned to these issues, one is the number of cases that have been filed against European member states, European Union member states. But another issue is their kind of relatively robust state aid regime, where they kind of, I think, as distinct from many other regions, have significant scrutiny over incentives and also significant powers to withdraw and modify incentives after they have been granted. So here are just some provisions. I won't go through them. We can send them to you that show what the CETA, the agreement between the European Union and its member states, and Canada, what it did with respect to incentives and subsidies in order to provide a little bit greater protection to the states and their ability to change those schemes. And then here is another provision in that treaty, which I think when you read the two together, it makes the protections for changes to subsidy schemes a little bit less solid. I think it raises some questions about whether and to what extent changes can still give rise to claims. Here's similar language in the EU-Vietnam Investment Protection Agreement, and they do very similarly to the EU-Canada agreement. They include some protections kind of affirming the ability of states to withdraw and or modify incentives without paying compensation to investors. But then they also include other language saying, that if there's a written agreement with investors and the investors rely on that agreement, then that agreement is protected from subsequent modification. So I think it's an open question how those two sets of provisions interact. And how a tribunal will treat that if there is a case challenging changes to those incentive schemes. Okay, so in terms of how the cases have approached these issues, I wanted to highlight some kind of broad trends. One is that you see variations based on how the incentives are granted. Many incentives are granted through legislation. You'll have your broad legal framework that grants the incentive, it's transparent, it's public. And tribunals, some have protected incentives when they're changed, have protected the investor's ability to kind of rely on those incentives, even when it's granted in legislation. And they've said, legislation can change, but we think that the investor had the ability to rely on the legislation as it was in place when the investor invested. So some tribunals will say that, but others will say, actually, absent some more kind of specific commitment to that investor, we won't actually protect the investor's expectation that it will be entitled to those incentives. So there's a variation when we see what happens when the incentives are granted through legislation. And what I think is also interesting about that is in some cases, such as in Spain, in the Spanish cases, the court said, looking at the same issue, that our incentive schemes are very, tentative, that the government retains significant powers to modify them as it does with legislation generally. But tribunals have not found that determinative, that whether or not you can domestically alter your incentives framework does not provide the answer to whether or not you can do so and avoid liability under the treaty. Another kind of set of issues arises when incentives are granted through contract or quasi-contractual arrangements. So you might actually have it through a written contract or this exchange of rights and obligations, but you might also have it through verbal statements or representations or assurances from an investment promotion agency. Those are more strongly protected, and tribunals are more inclined to protect investment incentives when they are granted through these specific commitments. And I think something that's important to note here, which again kind of follows on the last presentation, is they're not looking though at whether or not the incentives granted through these specific commitments were done through transparent processes, through processes that were actually legal under domestic law, by those with the appropriate authority to grant them. So kind of those governance issues are not relevant to the tribunal's determination of whether or not there was a specific commitment for the most part. So those are some, I think, some of the ways that investment tribunals approach to investment incentives might be sending kind of the wrong policy signals or entrenching incentives that were not granted in accordance with best practices. So another set of issues of how do tribunals approach the issue of incentives. And they tend to say that they will protect investment incentives. And again, this is summarizing kind of dozens of cases in trying to distill some of the trends. So we can talk about this in more detail. But generally, the approach is whether the investors relied on them. And I think while that intuitively makes sense, it's also important to look more closely at what they're doing. And when they're looking at what reliance is, it's not really, well, I guess you can look at it as whether the investment incentives influence the investor's decision. So broadly, did the investor use the incentives when it was modeling its expected financial performance? Did the offer of incentives make the project actually seem attractive to the investor? Those are some of the things that the tribunal will look at. But I think what it's not looking at is a stricter test of whether or not the investment incentive actually influenced the investor's decision to invest in a particular location or to invest in a particular project. There's no real inquiry about whether, kind of at what amount or for what duration did the incentive cause the investor to invest, and what amounts or what duration went beyond what was necessary in order to influence the investment decision or to tip the decision to invest from one jurisdiction to another. So there really is no examination of efficiency of whether or not you're protecting an investment incentive at a level that was necessary and efficient, or whether you are supporting kind of an additional cash transfer from public to private. So we're really looking at investor expectations rather than real proof of reliance or connection with ops policies. So here, just some additional issues that I wanted to flag that will be kind of too much to get into, but I think merit additional inquiry. One is that the claimants that we see in the projects are often the shareholders. They're often upstream equity investors in FDI projects. So they're not the FDI project company, with a managerial expertise that's coming in to, for instance, develop an infrastructure project, to invest in a manufacturing facility. It's the kind of upstream capital investors. So what implications does that have for incentives and the types of capital that governments are trying to attract, but also our analysis and evaluation of when incentive schemes are useful? I think another issue is that many of these investor claimants are based in tax haven jurisdictions. So they're not from the home country that has signed the treaty. That's not directly routed from a home country to a host country, but goes through an intermediate tax haven jurisdiction. And when so the award goes back to that corporate entity in the tax haven jurisdiction, there are questions then about how that award, which may be based on future lost profits, is taxed. Another issue that I wanted to flag briefly is the issue of remedies. Oftentimes people talking about investment treaties will say, they're relatively unobtrusive because they don't cause governments to change their measures, to change their policies. What they are doing is when there is a breach, they just have to pay compensation. But I just wanted to flag that in this context, the distinction is really kind of less relevant when we're talking about financial or fiscal incentives. The remedy would be to award the payment of the incentives that have been withdrawn or that have been reduced. So you really have kind of a change of the underlying measure, at least for those investors that were covered. Another issue is this issue of, again, transparency arises in the context of settlements. About 30% of ISDS cases are settled through non-transparent agreements between investors and states. And in this context, it increases the risk of kind of arbitrary, discriminatory, distortionary, and non-transparent grants of incentives. So here, again, how do the outcomes from investment treaties and ISDS map onto the outcomes that we want to see, again, for use of investment policies, and particularly in investment incentives? The issue of performance requirements was also addressed in the last session, but the investment treaties, as Hani had indicated too, and maybe their work, investment treaties often contain provisions saying, well, you can't impose performance requirements, you can't impose local content requirements, but you can do it if you're also granting an advantage, granting an incentive. So in some ways, they're actually encouraging the use of investment incentives, making that countries can only adopt those measures if they're giving something in advance. And there's a question I would raise about what that does to the bargaining power between states and investors, particularly lower income countries, least developed countries that might already have a relatively low bargaining power as compared to some of the major investors. And then a final, maybe big kind of timely set of issues is how we bring more clarity to this discussion of investment treaties as tools for promoting certain types of investments, such as investments in renewable energy. Because we've seen so many of these cases brought against Spain and Italy, which arose out of modifications to the renewable energy scheme, one kind of common theme that you hear is that, look, at investment treaties are now good because they're protecting these investments and they're for promoting such investments. But I think that misses the fact that the investment treaties, they might be protecting the investments, but they really may not have been influencing that underlying decision of whether or not to invest. And they may be locking in incentives, or at least for those covered investors, that although they might have been desired and desirable to those investors, really are unduly draining public resources and are inefficient in incentives and just transferring, again, to just select investors, public resources. And then for the last slide, just instead, maybe to end on a high note, what could investment treaties actually do instead? I think they could do more actually to combat some of the races to the bottom, particularly through the use of locational incentives. We do have some examples of provisions in investment treaties where they try to address races to the bottom through lowering or non-enforcement of environmental or labor provisions. So it seems that using this approach, you could do something similar with respect to fiscal or financial incentives, but right now you don't really see those types of provisions. I think if there were such provisions, it would be important to do it in a way that you protect the flexibility of least developed countries or low income countries, to have some extra flexibility to use incentives, especially for regions within the countries and also for certain policy goals. So it's kind of performance-based incentives linked to environmental, social, and other objectives. So I think there is definitely room for increased cooperation on incentives in international investment agreements. Also, transparency and improvements in governance of those investment incentives would be important. So rather than having a system where we strongly protect investment incentives that were granted through non-transparent private processes, that we have a system where we're supporting better practices, best practices in terms of use of public funds. So maybe I will leave it there, and yeah, happy to take any questions or comments.
Thanks a lot, Liz. Great timing too. I'm happy about time respecting of the speaker so far. Good job. So yeah, so let me ask you a follow-up question. You mentioned that tribunals do not often assess the effectiveness of incentives, like attracting investment or the real impact on investment. So my question is, and I'm not an expert in this area of treaties, but I wonder how they could do so when, except for a few rare cases, not even ministers of finance, so the institution that actually designs and implements the incentive, do so, right? So is it really something that tribunals should look into as part of their mandate, or is something that you would like to see and more like as a best practice, right?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, right? I mean, it's, as again, the previous presentation highlighted, that kind of identifying the line at which an investment incentive is useful as opposed to wasteful is extremely difficult to do. And are tribunals the right actors to do it? And yeah, and I don't actually have an answer to that. It's more of the easier kind of first step of saying what they are doing now is looking at whether the investor says it relied. And I think that there are problems with that approach when you compare it with what we're hoping for from investment incentives best practice. And given that the kind of whole field of investment treaties is so closely related with investment incentive policy. To have that stark mismatch, I think is something that needs additional attention. But yes, I do think that it would be possible, especially because you can have processes whereby, you know, the investor provides more of its financial modeling of decisions made at the time to the tribunal. It doesn't need to be disclosed to the public, but kind of what was it considering? Was it looking at other locations? At what kind of, where do the investment incentives actually tip the decision to invest in one place versus another? At what point did they decide actually this is doable for us? So I think if you did have appropriate protections for confidential business information, that you could put a burden on investors to at least provide some more information that would help us better understand when an investment incentive actually did tip the scales.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. I think it's part of the chat that Frederick and Hanya were having on a similar note on how to track, for instance, where a business could have considered another location and that decision was affected by the incentive itself, right? Very tricky, but I think it's crucial to understand whether this is feasible at all, right? But I know that Irma has at least one more question for you, please.
Yes, Liz, thank you so much for this interesting presentation. I think it makes sense to have first Hania and then you. And I have two comments, one question, but I know that there are also some experts as participants. For instance, Marlene Parker from Jamaica, Scott Wilkie from Canada, Howard Mann from Canada, and of course, Pasquale Pistone. So if anyone can feel free to ask the question in the chat or raise the hand. But there are two comments. The first one is you say there is investment treaties as incentives, but I think that also a stabilization agreements as incentives. And I believe that Alexandra Redhead will talk about that in the mining industry. And especially because it really allows that the countries will go to this specific region of country, the multinationals will go to this specific country only if there is a stabilization agreement. And we know that in African countries and in some Latin American countries. The other thing that you have also is the legitimate expectations. Because even though it is a lot of discussion in investment about legitimate expectations, we also see, for instance, that in Colombia, the Constitutional Court say there is a legitimate expectations and therefore the tax incentives that they have for the hotel business that was like 20 years cannot be changed. And that means a lot because then it means that what Hania is saying right now about transparency, about tax expenditure, about monitoring, means that then you need to have this to be able to manage the expectations of the investors. But then my question to you is very radical, and hopefully you're okay with that one, because since we are also talking about the GLOBE and the minimum tax, you know that next to this discussion on incentives, we also have the Belt Road Initiative from China, and the Belt Road Initiative is not only for Eastern European countries, African and some Asian countries, and they have built their own network. Actually, I wrote a book chapter with two political scientists about it. And they have built in such a way that it makes also the incentives, building their own incentives, their own framework for this Belt Road Initiative. So how do you see that the G7 has said, let's go for a minimum tax and let's go look at China and let's go and look at this Belt Road Initiative?
I feel like that question might be beyond my depth. I haven't written a book chapter on the Belt and Road Initiative, but yeah, so I'm not quite sure I'll be able to give you a meaningful answer on that question. But I think, you know, in your point about stabilization and the importance of transparency, I mean, I think that one concern about investment treaties is that when you do have some of the investor state contracts providing for stabilization of fiscal or other provisions, you strengthen those stabilization clauses. There might be some uncertainty. So when you sign a contract in your domestic law will govern that contract. And there might be some uncertainty about what will happen to that provision if it goes before your constitutional court. And you'd think that that uncertainty is somehow built into the pricing and built into the risk, and that you have that, you know, there are some questions that somebody will at some point look at that contract and deem parts of it unenforceable. With investment treaties, you kind of remove that risk from the domestic court. So you also remove their say, and you remove the role of domestic law and policy. And for an investor, that might be a great thing, that you remove that risk, you remove those types of forces. But I think from a governance perspective, that unless you have issues of corruption and systemic kind of failures of courts, that you want the ability of domestic institutions to be able to review contracts and make sure that they're, you know, in accordance with the law, in accordance with good governance, even if that does create additional risk for the investor. But then you wonder, you know, what are the other mechanisms for addressing that risk? Is there risk insurance, or are there other tools in a way that doesn't put the burden on all of those that are kind of not party to the negotiation of the stabilization contract? So I don't know if that's quite on point, but sorry, I don't have very good answers.
I'm sure that the G7 discussion, the minimum tax, will come up in the final session of the roundtable, so we'll take it up there.
Great.
So thanks. There's time for one more. Juliana has a question for you, Liz. And maybe, okay, one more from Marlene, but let's try to keep both questions and answers short, please.
Perfect.
Juliana first, and then Marlene.
Sorry, I think my question goes out like with the same topic that you're discussing right now. And it's, what would be your outlook on defending tax structuring decisions based on this specific commitments that were written in certain article or agreement that is not publicly available or cannot be seen? Like, what will be your outlook about them?
You mean for companies that structure their operations based on tax agreements, like stabilization agreements with the country?
Exactly, in the sense that,
and
yes, because sometimes what happens is that you have to define your tax structure, right? And it's kind of like being challenged against avoidance. And some MNEs will say, well, yeah, I'm not committing it. It's just that I'm agreeing with this on the investment part. So basically, this is my goal rule for doing this or Y. So I'm not trying to avoid, I'm just committing or like accomplishing with whatever I got granted under the investment treaty or investment commitment.
Well, I'm not quite sure. I suppose I understand the question, or maybe I haven't thought as much about that particular issue.
Okay. So, yeah, basically was trying to understand, like, if you have in their experience seen that courts allowed or protect investors based on agreements that are not publicly available, whether those kind of same agreements could also be used by these investors for like supporting their decisions in any other aspects such as tax law.
Yeah, I think generally companies are able to rely on private contracts that are not kind of publicly available, even when they've been concluded with the state. I think the concern is when those contracts were actually concluded by government officials or entities without the authority to do so. And then they're kind of the legal relevance of those contracts and the company's abilities to rely on them is uncertain. But if you have some of those contracts, for instance, if a contract were entered into as a part of a settlement in an investor-state arbitration case between an investor and a state, and that contract was later deemed illegal by a domestic court, I think you could still, as an investor, rely on that contract, especially if it were entered as an award. So there's, again, it's uncertain, but I think generally, and probably unfortunately, non-public investor-state contracts are still kind of able, you can rely on those.
Okay.
Okay, let's have the very last one. Marlene, please, do you want to open your mic?
Yes, thank you very much. Augustine, my video is giving a bit of a challenge now. So I'll sort that out later.
No worries.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for all the presentations. And I was particularly struck by Hania's presentation, because I think it touched on an issue that I know, particularly in my jurisdiction, Jamaica, that we have been grappling with. The issue of incentives. We have had to repeal most of our tax incentives and so on, and actually saw an improvement in the collection of tax revenues once we got rid of the sector-specific incentives. The issue, though, and which she raised, and I think is very critical, is the one of having a rules-based and an approach of governance of tax incentives. I don't think that that has been inculcated in terms of our investment jargon or how we look at incentives. I think it is still very reactive. We have a special economic zone regime, which is probably the largest incentive regime that we now have. But certainly I think they need to constantly review your incentives, because it may not necessarily be something as elaborate as a special economic zone. Tax expenditure by other means are going on. There, customs incentives, there are to stimulate the tourist industry and that type of thing. All of those things are still going on and still contribute to the tax expenditure impact. And so I appreciated the point she made about having a rules-based and a tax governance approach to incentive, constantly reviewing, looking at the cost-benefit analysis as a part of the governance framework. So I just wanted to make that comment. And quickly also, it was striking to me that when the table that she had displayed regarding what is the main concern that investors have, that tax incentives was so far down the list, which is not the way I think most of our political directorate happen to see this. They think that it is the most important things, and immediately go into these negotiations offering these incentives without fixing the environmental, the environment into which this investment is gonna come. And on the table she displayed, I think what ranked the highest was the political and social stability of the country, a much more difficult issue to fix. And so that I think is, was striking as well. So I just had those two comments.
Thank you very much, Marlene. I think it's very insightful to have your experience. Maybe we can bring you on board for the roundtable in the end. That would be very interesting. And Haya, maybe you can take some notes and take that up so that we can continue. But thanks a lot, Marlene. So Simon, thanks for being here. Nice to see you. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Augustine, for the opportunity to speak. And my presentation, I think, will complement nicely the last two. The last two, as I understand it, talked about tax breaks as they relate to one form of cross-border commerce, which is the movement of capital and investment. I will talk about principally tax breaks as they relate to the cross-border movement of goods. Now, we've just heard from Marlene about how you can have tax breaks related to importing, and there are indeed tax breaks relating to exporting too, which will form a large part of the story that I want to tell. I'll now raise some slides and then take you through the evidence that I want to share with you. So my focus will be much more on tax incentives, as I said, in cross-border movement of goods, although, as we have heard, the issue could apply to just about the cross-border commerce in general. Now, from an international trade perspective, we're interested in tax breaks which create some form of discrimination or extend some form of discrimination. And that discrimination can be between domestic and foreign commercial interests, and it could be among different types of foreign commercial interests as well. Another way, and the discrimination could be between whole classes of firms, or in other cases, we have a very selective firm-specific types of tax breaks, which are potential concern. It should also be said that the tax breaks relating principally to exporting and the like can well be selective in the sense of targeting certain sectors and certain locations as well. So in setting this up, when we think about this from an international trade point of view, we're interested in the impact of tax incentives on the incentive to engage in cross-border trade. Now, we have at the WTO, certainly in trade and in manufactured goods, a very explicit ban on export subsidies. However, when it comes to reading the particular agreement, there is a rather ambiguous footnote which does not clarify particularly the status of tax-related incentives to export. And there are some, there's some debate as to which of the following examples constitute a WTO legal or illegal measure. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about WTO legality. I'm not a lawyer, I'm an economist. What I want to do is to give you examples of these types of tax breaks as they relate to exporting and importing, and then talk about their prevalence and then about the amount of trade which is involved. And the goal ultimately is to try and demonstrate that this actually is an area which is worth a lot more attention. Now, in terms of examples, just to fix ideas, Brazil has a number of schemes whereby exporting firms can earn credits against key domestic taxes. And so essentially, we do not provide, or Brazil does not provide a payment to firms for exporting, but it allows them to accumulate credits which can then be used to lower their domestic tax bill. So it is a tax-related export incentive in our view. A second and different type of tax break relates to value-added taxes. And most jurisdictions which have value-added taxes regimes have full rebates for imported inputs which are used in exported goods. And so these full and complete VAT rebates regimes are quite standard in many of the industrialized countries and some developing countries. But there are some developing countries which have partial VAT rebates, where the degree of VAT rebate depends a lot on the product being imported or exported, and the degree of the rebate is a choice of the government. And so some countries such as China have essentially partial VAT rebate regimes. And these VAT rebates can be adjusted, and in so doing, of course, they affect indirectly the cost of imported inputs and the overall cost of the good. And this in turn in competitive markets can have implications for the amount supplied to foreign markets. Now, the Chinese regime is so pervasive and extensive that in 2010, the WTO Secretariat wrote that it was tantamount to a system of export management. Now, it's almost inconceivable that the WTO Secretariat would write that today about China, but that tells you something about what's happened over the last 10 years. But the assessment that VAT rebates could be used in this way has been very clear from the WTO from the start. Now, I had a third example here of VAT rebates relating to, or tax breaks relating to the production of wide-bodied aircraft by Boeing. Of course, wide-bodied aircraft are internationally traded, but this is, I think, of a slightly different nature, and this is a rebate against local tax obligations. But still, we have a whole range of different types of tax-related measures which can affect the cross-border movement of goods. So having identified examples of them, the next thing I want to do is to discuss the prevalence of them. And to do that, I'm going to draw from the Global Trade Alert database, which my colleagues and I at St. Gallen have been assembling for the last dozen years. And this is a database of unilateral policy measures. So unlike some of the colleagues today who've talked about the important role that bilateral and regional agreements can play in terms of tax breaks, here I'm talking about unilateral policy decisions which governments have taken. And we have collected a lot of data on those unilateral tax breaks. And so what I've tried to do is to summarize those tax breaks or the resort to those tax breaks in the following statistics. And so on the left-hand side, we have a chart showing the number of instances where the tax breaks were expanded. And you can see that there's around 100 of them per year. And this surges in 2020 as a number of extremely targeted tax reductions were introduced in the area of medical goods. And that example, of course, highlights that there may well be a non-economic rationale for a tax break which affects trade. And no one denies that, we just identify it. Then we also have cases where incentives have been reduced. So it's not just a matter that, that incentives are expanded always, but as is often the case in our database, the number of trade distortions introduced typically exceeds the number of measures which reduce the distortion or the influence over trade. So we have an area where we see quite a lot of action, and if anything, 3/4 of them are measures which are likely to distort trade from what would have happened in the absence of a neutral regime. Now, just another factual point which I should put on the table, about 1/4 of the tax breaks in our database were firm specific. I was surprised by that. I thought the fraction would be much, much larger, but it does indicate that there are quite a number of sector specific and also potentially location specific tax breaks as well. Right, so this is a number, this is data on the prevalence of these measures. And I think the next question people might want to ask is, well, how much trade is involved with them? Well, for each measure, we can identify, if it's especially as it relates to goods matters, the products which are eligible for the tax break, and we can then use existing trade data to be able to identify which foreign markets are potentially affected by these tax breaks, because a country may offer a tax break to export abroad, and we can know which foreign markets the goods are exported to, and then we can identify the amount of trade in those markets which is potentially distorted by a tax break or a change in tax breaks. So in other words, and as my trade economist colleagues will know, we can estimate the amount of trade covered by different types of policy interventions. But just before I show you those numbers, let me show you which countries are doing these measures. These are the top 10 countries which have engaged in these measures, and we can see that as far as increasing incentives are concerned, the United States and China and India pretty much lead the pack. And in terms of reducing incentives, China has form in cutting back incentives as well. It's interesting that most of the incentive cutting is being done by emerging markets, and a lot of the incentive granting is done by industrialized and emerging markets. All right, so let me turn then to the amounts of trade implicated by these different types of tax breaks. And here we have in this particular chart our estimates of the share of world goods trade that is covered by increased export incentives, normally tax-based export incentives, and the amount of trade which is covered by reductions in tax-based export incentives. And there's a very substantial difference between the amounts of trade involved. Now, just to help you interpret this chart, the Global Trade Alert database goes back to November 2008. So imagine that the world began in November 2008. Why that month? Because that was the month that the G20 leaders decided that they would issue trade distortions and protectionism. And from that month onwards, imagine that we then collect data on the amount of trade which is affected by different types of tax breaks related to exporting. And so in November 2008, these numbers would have been 0. So it's very telling that in 2009, we have 30% of world trade covered by tax breaks for exporting. And this actually reflects the fact that in 2009, China dramatically expanded the scope and product coverage and the generosity of its VAT rebate scheme. And so China jumps in with a significant expansion in its export incentives. And because China exports a huge amount abroad and the products eligible for those incentives compete in lots of world markets, then in principle, conditions of competition in 30% of world trade was immediately affected by this. And you can see over time, there's a trend increase with some variation in the amount of world trade which is affected by or covered by tax breaks. And you can see around 60% of world trade is our best estimate of the amount of trade covered. And by the way, these calculations are made at the most fine-grained product level available in global trade, which is at the 6-digit level of the harmonized system. So you cannot do more granular calculations than the one we have done at the moment. And so if you have any concerns about aggregation biases, there's nothing more we can do about this because we're using the best data available. Now, just to give you some sense about this, this 60% level of of world trade coverage, this is about twice the size of the global trade covered by subsidies to import competing firms, and about 4 times the size of world trade, which is affected by tariff increases. This is by far the largest form of trade distortion, which is out there, and it's rarely discussed in policy circles. And this is an amazing oversight, quite frankly. Now, if you look at the lowering or removal of tax breaks, this does affect a growing amount of world trade, now less than 10% of world trade. And there have been some years when tax breaks were removed and then reintroduced. But essentially, the ratio of trade covered by tax incentives to export to tax withdrawals is about 6 to 1. And this gives you a sense of how serious this matter is. Now, in terms of thinking about the effects of these particular measures, when a country decides to offer export incentives to its manufacturers, this helps those manufacturers acquire market share at the expense of rival countries, exporters who do not receive any subsidies or who receive less subsidies. There is now a small and growing econometric literature which shows that the exposure of a firm to rivals who are subsidized reduces the probability of the original firm from winning a contract and retaining contracts. And we have econometric evidence showing that the expansion in these tax breaks and the like has resulted in untaxed and unsubsidized exports growing less quickly. So there appears to be a competitive effect generated by these subsidies. So the scale of this thing is quite substantial, and as I said, there's econometric work suggesting that this is a problem. Now, the problem is growing not just at a global level, but also for key groups of developing countries here. And we have essentially in this particular chart, I reproduced the world line from the last chart, plus the share of sub-Saharan and least developed country exports, which compete against other firms which have received tax breaks for exporting. And you can see that the poorest countries in the world, the least developed countries and the sub-Saharan African countries, find that more and more of their exports compete against subsidized rivals. And most of the subsidization for tax breaks in exporting comes from the large emerging markets. So China, India, Brazil, and South Africa. And it's the expansion of their incentives which has led to this increased exposure of least developed countries in the sub-Saharan African countries to unfavorable market conditions. And in recent econometric work, we've shown that this has led to a growth slowdown in their exports as well. So there's probably a serious development dimension to this, as well as a systemic global trade problem as well. Let me then wrap this up by talking about, well, what is to be done in the future? Well, I mean, I'm a big supporter of the initiative that Augustine and his colleagues have undertaken. I think it's a great initiative. A lot of their work has highlighted the domestic consequences of tax breaks. And what I've hoped to show in this particular short presentation is that there can be cross-border consequences too. And I see this presentation as complementing the last two, which have focused on international investment. My presentation was much more on trade in goods. And we find that not only are there a large number of these interventions over time, but also they cover large shares of world trade. We also have an econometric literature suggesting that the effects of these incentives on export growth is now being clearly identified. Now, this type of evidence has been taken to Geneva, to the WTO, to be presented, but we need much more discussions on these particular topics in the international organizations. And we need to raise the awareness of the effects of these tax breaks and the fact that they can represent a distortion to world trade. Now, as you've probably surmised, once we have these levels of intervention affecting so much world trade, there's probably public finance implications associated with these tax breaks as well. And I'm sure colleagues who know anything about the Brazilian experience will know that attempts by the Brazilian finance ministry to reduce these tax breaks have been rejected in the Brazilian legislature And this is not the only example one could point to where the tax breaks have generated public finance concerns, and finance ministries may well be interested in rolling back these incentives. And here they could join forces with trade ministries who are interested in reducing the degree of trade distortion, which is found in global markets. So I think there's plenty to be done, but this is we're at a very early stage in terms of having a policy impact on from an understanding of the impacts of tax breaks on goods trade. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Simon. Great presentation, very clear. And also your closing remark on how tricky reforming tax breaks and tax expenditures can be, and the role that trade ministries can play there. It's crucial, and I think it's something that we might want to take up in the roundtable, because we have seen also in Colombia, previously in France with the Gilets jaunes, every time that governments try to reform tax expenditures, communication, timing can be really crucial for the success of such a reform, right? So that's totally a fair point to be made. But let me ask you a more technical question, or based on your presentation, not technical, but based on your presentation right now. You showed in that graph the difference between emerging and rich countries when it comes to increasing and reducing the use of tax breaks lately. I don't know the years that you were showing there. Do you have a rush? I found that a very interesting result, right? It's very clear, the division between the two groups of countries. Do you have a rationale of why this is happening? Is this coming from some coordination among countries within those groups, soft law by international organizations? What is going on there?
I think it's a great question. I mean, as you know, we try and track unilateral policy changes. So I must say, having reviewed all those interventions, there's not much evidence that I see that these incentives have been reduced in coordination with other countries. So I suspect that these are unilateral acts, possibly reflecting differences in industrial policy priorities and possibly for public finance considerations too. So, but I don't want to rule out the fact that this could have happened, but it does not immediately come to mind that there was a coordinated attempt here.
Okay, yeah, and you also mentioned the use of tax breaks in the context of health-related goods. I think you mentioned lately. My understanding is that due to the pandemic, probably, right?
That's correct. So a number of countries not only reduced their tariffs on imported medical goods, those tariff reductions were not part of my presentation. What was part of my presentation is that a number of countries reduced or suspended the collection of value-added taxes on imported goods. And so that's a selective tax reduction. It may be one which has an extremely sensible public policy rationale, but it's still a selective tax reduction which has implications for cross-border trade. What we're seeing, Augustine, is that a number of those tax reductions have been reversed, but not all of them. So there may well be medium-term consequences as governments reevaluate the wisdom of taxing the importation of medicines, detergents, soap, and medical equipment.
That's one of the issues with tax expenditures in general, right? That once they are in place, it's very difficult to get rid of them. Yeah, and
yes.
To really, yeah, that's also an interesting feature. And besides this sector-specific ad hoc, let's say, or shock-specific to the COVID feature that you mentioned, is there other sector where tax breaks that affect trade for goods are specifically or highly prevalent in general, and besides the pandemic, normal?
I understand. So the answer is yes, and I think here you have to look at the biggest emerging markets for where the action is. I mean, the Chinese literally expand and contract these incentives, the VAT rebates, in line with a number of considerations. Sometimes they're industrial policy incentives, so they may industrial policy priorities, so they may want to reduce the VAT inputs on inputs into, say, the semiconductor sector, and in the case of India, we have clear targeting of tax breaks to sectors that the Modi government wants to build up, manufacturing sectors. So this is very much part of the industrial policy packages that many countries are putting together. Whether it's good policy, I take no position on, but it certainly is likely to have an impact on cross-border trade.
Fair enough. And let me take you a bit out from today's topic on goods, because you really focused your presentation, but I know that you also work a lot on services trade, so you are definitely well positioned to discuss. So we know that tax incentives in the context of energy taxation are often introduced to avoid the so-called competitiveness effect and protect energy-intensive and trade-exposed sectors. That's often the argument out there. Could a carbon border adjustment mechanism, such as the one being discussed in the context of the EU Green Deal, be an effective alternative to that implementation of tax incentives in such a context? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think the broader question, you're absolutely right, which is that suppose a carbon tax is imposed. How do we treat imported goods? Of course, is one thing, but then to what extent do we tax or to what extent will governments impose those carbon taxes on goods which are being exported? Right, and this I think is that will be a very interesting question. But some people will argue quite rightly that that's an inducement to export. Yep. So I think there's that what you're describing really is perhaps the next big chapter of where this discussion about tax breaks and exporting goes. So it's not just the classic carbon leakage issue, but also the carbon the sort of support for firms which are engaged in exports which are carbon users. I should add, by the way, that in the EU, it's not a tax break, but the governments do give out lots of free emissions trading permits to carbon-intensive industries at the moment. You asked a more broader question about the link to services, though, and that is, I should highlight that a number of the emerging markets have started to offer VAT rebates on inputs which are used for service sector exports, period. So it's not just VAT rebates which are used on imported goods for exporting, which is what the Chinese do. South Africa has a scheme, if I understand it right, which enables service exporters to claim back on their VAT payments on inputs into service production. So there is a growing service dimension here too.
Okay, great. Yeah, good point. Totally. And there's one last one from Emmanuel from the OECD. Emmanuel, do you want to ask Simon the question directly?
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you so much. These are hugely important and quite shocking to the degree of distortions. I wonder, do you know what the share is roughly between local tax incentives and national tax incentives? Do you look at that at all in terms of
we have
trade policy and how much is tax policy actually going to be able to do?
Right. So there is this is a really good question and important in some for understanding what's going on in some jurisdictions, not least the United States. So a lot of the tax breaks given at the subnational level in the US are likely to be propping up firms which are engaged in international trade. And the trade covered by that is actually really quite substantial. And so I'd be happy to share with you, Emmanuel, a paper which was published earlier in the year, which shows that when you compare the sort of barriers that the US has put up against Chinese imports by the federal government to the distortion to imports from China, which arise from tax breaks offered by local governments, the local governments, it is, let me put it this way, it is as if the local governments declared a trade war on China 5 years before Donald Trump did. Okay, so it turns out that what you see at the federal level in terms of trade barrier increases, which we all know about and read about, this follows a ramping up of the trade distortions through to tax breaks, which we saw at the local level. And that comes through very strongly in the data. Again, so much of this depends on the manner in which a country's federal structure is organized and the powers that are available at each level of government. But in the US case, there's a very distinct pattern, which I think is important if you want to get the full picture on how Chinese trade is facing complications in the US market.
Great.
Very
Thanks.
much.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Vertical interaction in tax policy, but when it comes to tax measures, I think it's crucial, but it's tricky, very tricky. While working with the GTED, we have realized how difficult it is to get data, not only at the national level, let alone the sub-national level, right? So it's certainly very a crucial question in federations, for instance. Thank you very much, Simon. So let's move directly to Alexandra, our last speaker today. We will get a sector-specific presentation on the extractive and mining sector. So please, Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Augustine. Hopefully you can see my screen.
Partly.
It's a bit moved to the left. I don't know why. But.
Let me just try. Sorry, one moment. Let me try once more.
Yep, there it goes. Yeah.
All good? Fantastic. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much, Augustine, for the introduction and for the invitation. My name is Alexandra, or Ali Reedhead, and I lead our work on tax and extractives for the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining. For those of you that don't know, IGF is a membership organisation, so we have over 70 member countries, all of whom are resource rich, and the majority are developing countries. And so we provide policy advice and support to member countries, and in particular we have a program together with the OECD, but also with regional organisations such as ATAF and CEAT to help members address or improve revenue collection from the mining sector, and more particularly to look at issues of tax base erosion and profit shifting in the sector. And so as part of that work, we've done a lot on mining tax incentives, trying to understand the prevalence of tax incentives in the sector, the effectiveness and efficiency of those incentives, the impacts on revenue collection, and perhaps the unintended consequences of tax incentives in terms of creating additional loopholes or exacerbating existing loopholes in relation to profit shifting. So a lot of our work is policy oriented, so working directly with governments. And that's what I'm going to share a little bit of with you today. So I think the first thing, and is really that there's no evidence that incentives are effective at attracting mining investment. And this is partly because there hasn't been any systematic studies on the use of tax incentives in the mining sector. We've looked at it largely at an anecdotal level, and at an anecdotal level, it's certainly very compelling that incentives have not been effective and have oftentimes been inefficient and led to governments foregoing revenue unnecessarily. But that's purely at an anecdotal level. So there is no systematic study on the effectiveness of tax incentives in the mining sector. So there's no evidence to support the fact that incentives are effective one way or the other. I think we're generally of the view that their effectiveness is fairly limited in this sector in particular, largely because you're dealing with a resource that's location specific. It can't be moved to a location that is more favourable in terms of taxation, and that whilst all else being equal, certainly incentives might be relevant with respect to investment decisions, that those decisions are driven primarily by the quality of the resource, your ability to access and extract the resource, and of course mineral prices and demand. So tax incentives kind of come fairly low down the priority list for mining investors. So for those reasons, I guess those theoretical reasons, and certainly the anecdotal evidence that we have, we tend to think that mining investment is not particularly responsive to tax incentives, particularly to profit-based tax incentives. And I know there's been some discussion around that. And in an industry like mining, where you may take a long time before you actually even generate any profit, often profit-based incentives, things like tax holidays, are not really going to move the dial for mining investors, whereas things like cost-based incentives, so in particular accelerated depreciation, longer loss carry forwards, immediate expensing of exploration expenses. These sorts of incentives are going to be more material for investors because it will determine how quickly they can recover their investment. And given that it's such a intensive, cost-intensive sector with such long lead times, that's going to be much more pertinent to the decision to invest as opposed to profit-based incentives. So, you know, there's certainly some nuance there, but I think generally, certainly there's no evidence to support the conclusion that incentives are effective, and indeed there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that would suggest the contrary. So despite this, as I think all of us can attest, they still are very prevalent, and even in this sector where perhaps the theoretical basis or justification for incentives is much lower than in many other sectors that are more mobile. So we have at IGF, we have built a database of mining tax incentives. So we looked at over 100 mining concession agreements across the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, and basically we had to look at, in each of those countries, what was the general law that was generally applicable to all companies. Then secondary to that, what was the primary law that was applicable to mining investors, bearing in mind that there might be some tax incentives that are embedded in the law itself. So something like accelerated depreciation is a good example of that. And then lastly, we looked at concession agreements, so the investment agreements that have been spoken of, to see what further incentives were provided at the level of the investment contract to give us a more granular picture of how widely used tax incentives are and what types of tax incentives are most common. And I think this database is quite an important contribution because there hasn't really been, well, there is no other database like this one, but also because we look at the level of the investment contract specifically, which is where many of these tax incentives are contained. So if we just look at the level of the primary law, oftentimes the conclusion is that mining is actually, governments are engaging in upwards tax competition rather than downwards tax competition. But when we look in the investment agreements, the picture is quite different. So on the screen here, you can see, based on that database, the breakdown or the prevalence of incentives by region. So clearly quite widely used in Africa in particular. And I think the most of greatest concern here is that in African countries, there's much higher prevalence of incentives in investment contracts. And that raises concerns with respect to transparency, disclosure, obviously discretion, political corruption in the granting of those incentives. So that's a key concern, particularly for African countries, as opposed to other regions where they might have incentives, but at least they're in the primary law. And so they're, you know, eligible to all investors and they can be monitored and subject to public scrutiny. The types of tax incentives that we see in the mining sector. So you can see here, again, this is broken down by, you know, incentives in the law versus incentives in contracts. The types of incentives in the sector, so cost-based incentives like accelerated depreciation, loss carry forwards, through to corporate income tax holidays, withholding tax relief, tax stabilization. So there's a whole range of incentives. As you can see in the chart, the most common types of incentives are those relating to corporate income tax. So whether that's a preferential rate or a holiday, which is especially concerning, as I said, because, you know, profit-based incentives just don't make sense for this sector. A tax holiday is going to be, you know, it's a nice to have for an investor, but it's not going to determine whether or not they make the decision to invest. Withholding tax relief, again, kind of cause for concern, particularly because of the risks that that creates in terms of base erosion and profit shifting. In the mining sector, we see huge levels of debt financing via related parties. So withholding tax relief on interest expense opens up avenues for profit shifting. And then tax stabilization, and that came up earlier in Lisa's presentation, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, but tax stabilization is the mother of all tax incentives, if you like, because in a concession agreement and in the law as well, it has the potential to just freeze all other tax incentives. So it's potentially quite detrimental, particularly as countries learn perhaps and realize that certain types of incentives were perhaps not effective or led to substantial revenue loss, that their ability to then unwind those incentives is really limited by stabilization. And what I think the other thing that we see in the sector in developing countries is that these incentives are really informed by analysis or financial modeling. And obviously we're not naive enough, we're not so naive as to perhaps not appreciate why there isn't more financial modeling. I think oftentimes technocrats can be ignored in the process of granting incentives, and politicians will do what they're going to do regardless of what the modeling says. So, you know, there's clearly a huge political economy challenge when it comes to incentives, but at least making sure that there's more financial modelling and analysis going in would be a good step forward. So the example here is of a gold mine in Côte d'Ivoire. This analysis is done by Open Oil, and it's a kind of complicated chart, but really what you need to understand is that they had a 5-year tax holiday in their mining law, which was given to this mine. This mine, before the tax break, had an internal rate of return of nearly 30%. And after the tax break was removed, the tax holiday, its internal rate of return was still 25%, which is a very healthy return for a gold mine. And so the result was that government effectively left $120 million on the table. Now, when they made that decision, there was no financial modelling. They've subsequently removed that tax holiday from their law, but of course, many of these investment agreements are subject to stabilisation. I mentioned earlier the prevalence of corporate income tax holidays, and this I think is particularly striking because, you know, if there's been one message, at least in the mining sector, and I think more broadly in other sectors, it's that, you know, broad-based corporate tax holidays just have no place. And certainly in this sector, yet despite that, we see you know, consistently countries introducing these tax holidays as early as this year. So Rwanda do it for the mining sector. We saw Zimbabwe do it for specific mining projects. So it kind of, again, we come back to the political economy question, I think, and perhaps we haven't done our job well enough to differentiate between different types of incentives and which are more or less effective. So this is a key issue, is the number of tax holidays and the period. And that it creates not just tax holidays, but many types of incentives create opportunities for profit shifting. And this has been a key focus for us at IGF. Is it's one thing to, as a government, determine or agree on how much revenue you're willing to forego as a result of an incentive. And then it's another thing to have these kind of unanticipated or unintended consequences where that then opens up a whole raft of profit shifting risks. So the example on the screen is of high grading, a practice in the mining sector, which we see, and this is based on a real example, where you know, during the period of the tax holiday, the company extracts the highest grade ore at a very fast rate, so that then when the tax holiday expires, the production and the income left to tax is much lower than what it would have otherwise been. And so these are some of the unintended consequences or the ways that companies will change their behaviour in response to incentives that we think policymakers need to be particularly mindful of. And factoring in these BEPS risks into financial modelling, again, is very important and something that we do in our financial modelling work. Fiscal stabilisation, so I'll be brief, I've probably gone over time, but as I said, mother of all tax incentives, and we just see it, you know, across the board in the extractive sector. It's a long run business, so investors come in and they demand stabilisation of fiscal terms. For the most part, governments have granted those, and in some case, some level of predictability is certainly warranted, but that should be within a range and, you know, ideally flexible and based on achieving an economic equilibrium rather than just freezing fiscal terms. And I think the last point that I might make here is just coming back to the discussions that have been had already around the global minimum tax. Like yesterday, we had a webinar on this issue, and in particular, the issues that around implementation, where countries that are looking to align with Pillar 2, many of these countries have stabilised tax incentives in contracts, laws, and treaties. And what's going to happen is not only do they forego the revenue first time round as a result of the incentive, but then there's going to be a transfer of tax revenue from the source country to the residence country as a result of Pillar 2, if those incentives remain stabilised. And the reality is most countries are unable to unilaterally unwind those incentives without winding up in arbitration. So this is a real issue, I think, particularly in the extractive sector, but certainly in many other sectors where there are large investment agreements. And we need to make sure that the inclusive framework protects countries that remove stabilised tax incentives. So there needs to be some kind of transitional arrangement or endorsement of that practice, provided that it's with the specific purpose of aligning with Pillar 2. So I think I'll stop there. Augustine, I've gone over time already. So just a few thoughts from the sector that we're focused on.
Thanks a lot, Ali. Great presentation. Let me ask you, so I had a similar question for Hani, actually. So you showed or mentioned that tax holidays particularly are very bad policy in the context of the mining sector and shouldn't be there. It's kind of a whispered agreement there or consensus. But yet we observe that these particular tax holidays are being more and more implemented, right? What do you think that explains that? What's the reason? I mean, we all agree that technically they don't make sense. They don't add in terms of additionality in investment. They're not effective. They are costly. Many issues. Why is it that governments keep insisting on this? What's your gut feeling? I know it's a tricky one, but just I'm curious about.
That is a tricky one. I guess my instinctive response, and I'd be interested to hear what other people have to say about this. My instinctive response is because it's easy. It's a very easy, obvious form of incentive to give, and versus thinking, in a more smart, targeted way along the lines of performance-based incentives, as Hannah mentioned, or other, simply more targeted and more sector-appropriate incentives. So my sense is that it's just an easy incentive to give, and it probably also reflects the disconnect between the technocrats and the decision makers as well. Is my suspicion is that, at least in the mining or the extractive sector more broadly, these investment agreements and the final decision is taken, at the highest level, where there's not always a very good understanding of tax incentives, what's good, what's bad, how to design smart tax incentives. So my sense is that A, it's easy to give, and B, it probably reflects a lack of understanding amongst decision makers, despite perhaps what the technicians are telling them. I'm not sure.
Okay, thanks.
What do you think?
No, I have no clue. For me, it's like it's $1 million question, right? It's not only related to the mining sector and not only to tax holidays. So for me, it's like a broader question, why? And that's why I thought that question was for Hania. Why, besides all this, evidence against tax incentives, why are they so prevalent all over?
Maybe if I can just jump in very briefly, because that's funny. I had the same question, and I was going to say, speak to our experience. And it's along the lines of what you were saying, that they're easier to advertise, easier to understand for investors, and they're much, much easier to administer. So what we find, particularly in developing countries, especially in Africa, is that just getting out of the administrative burden of filing taxes, because in a lot of these countries, they don't have to file taxes if they're on a holiday, is a huge, secondary incentive that comes from that benefit. So they're not even filing taxes, and they're kind of parading around for their 10, 15, 20 years, and then they'll often try to extend that. So it's just not only an actual financial boost, but also an administrative boost for the investors, and also much easier, because administering merit-based incentives is much more complicated.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, you know, when policymakers, decision makers go to trade shows, we see them at the mining indaba in South Africa, where they all come and, you know, to spruik their wares. It's very easy to say we have a corporate tax holiday rather than explaining some more complicated, you know, performance-based tax incentive. But I also think, on the other hand, and you know, what a lot of investors say to us is that, you know, I'm talking big end of town here in the mining sector, is that they are wary of corporate income tax holidays. It's not to say they won't accept them if offered, but they're wary of them because they know that they're unsustainable, and that ultimately it will come back to bite them later on. And because, you know, you get 5 years, 10 years in, especially in something like extractives, which is so visible, has such a massive impact on the environment and the community, you know, you get, 10, 15 years in and everyone's saying, well, hang on a second, what's going on here? And so I think investors are quite wary. The ones that we speak to are more wary of tax holidays because they know that they're not sustainable and that they will, you know, governments will try and unwind them at some point. Yeah.
Okay, and let me ask one more to you, Ali, and then we can open the floor again for the roundtable to all speakers. So one other thing that strikes me also in the field of the extractive sector, but because basically your focus is usually on developing countries, right? These rich resource countries are usually among developing or poor economies. What strikes me a bit is the question about informality. So I remember having this conversation with you, and I was ignorant about the mining sector itself. My understanding of the mining sector, or my picture, was a few big players, usually multinationals, you know, getting all these tax rates. But actually, the industrial structure, when it comes to the extractive sector, is much more complex, and there's a lot of informality and small players and even informal workers. And when you think about informality, this is a crucial feature, right? Because by definition, any support for firms or individuals that go through the tax system does not target informal workers or businesses. So how does governments deal with that, right? On the one hand, they use more and more tax incentives to support, for instance, the mining sector, the extractive sector, but they also know that they just cannot target the whole share of the informal economy through that.
Yeah. Yeah, lots of things there, I think. So I think at one level, you know, the types of tax incentives that we see, as you say, are targeting kind of large scale formalized mining. So immediately there's the small scale artisanal miners are at a disadvantage because the same tax benefits are not necessarily available to them, which is an issue when you're talking about, you know, it's largely foreign multinationals. So we're kind of preferencing foreign multinationals ahead of, you know, communities and individuals and individual livelihoods. So I think that's a challenge. I think the second issue is perhaps more of an opportunity that, you know, there's lots of discussion about, there's always been a lot of discussion about how do we formalize the small scale artisanal mining sector, in part to get them into the tax net, because, you know, some of that is very poor, lowly work, but a lot of it is also very high value if you're talking about gemstones and precious metals. And it's a source of, a worrying source of illicit financial flows, funding kind of terrorism activities and so on. So there is a need to try and bring that group into the tax net, if only to, well, collect more revenue, but also have greater oversight over their activities and what's going on. And so there, I think, there's opportunities here in terms of how the potentially tax incentives that can be used to encourage those groups to formalize more in the form of subsidies, I would say, than incentives as such. But I think there's an opportunity there, and it's something that we're working on actually as part of our program on the future of resource taxation. Is, you know, what sort of subsidies might be appropriate to try and help formalize the informal and bring them into the tax net. So, because there's a lot of untapped revenue there, definitely, and as well as I said, a source of illicit financial flows. I think, and the last thing I'll just say, Augustine, I think more broadly is like more generally opportunities for more performance-based incentives, because in this sector, you know, we're seeing a lot of changes in the sector, and not just mining, in terms of automation, technology, so less workers at the mine site. And so looking at how can we, if we are going to give incentives, how do we do that in a way that encourages knowledge transfer, more greater value addition in the source country? So trying to keep more of the, the value in country. And then secondly, we're also seeing the rise of critical minerals and renewable, the role that mining will play in the renewable energy transition. And so again, I think that gives mining countries a strategic advantage potentially going forward to demand more from companies in terms of the fiscal terms, but also maybe there's an opportunity there to think about tax incentives. How do we design tax incentives to encourage or incentivize exploration of critical minerals to actually meet demand as well? So I think there's some interesting opportunities there, and maybe this is what we've been missing, is maybe that the message has just been income tax holidays are bad, tax incentives are bad, and we haven't really provided a sufficiently nuanced message for policymakers to really give them alternatives to say, okay, you obviously want to do something for whatever reason, well, here are some alternatives. So, I mean, that message has been put across, but perhaps it's not been done well enough. I think Howie made a good comment in the chat that part of the explanation for tax holidays is, and he's right, is that a lot of the people that are making decisions in these countries have been very much kind of, ingrained in them the need to give tax holidays. They kind of cut their teeth in the 80s and the 90s, and there was a lot of rhetoric from international organizations during that period as well about rolling the red carpet out for investors. So it takes a while to perhaps reverse that psychology.
No, totally agree. So I would ask the speakers to open your mics and video if you can and want, so that we have a bit of dynamic session here. And I know that Pasquale will need to leave a bit earlier, and we don't have a lot of time, so I will start with you, Pasquale.
Yeah, thanks very much, Agustin.
Yeah, it was mentioned. Yeah, go.
Yeah, please say it.
No, I was going to ask a question. It was mentioned a few times, the role of tax incentives in the current discussions, and you mentioned already current discussion of the minimum corporate income tax and what the future of tax incentives could be in the context of that discussion. Maybe if you have some remarks to.
Yeah, I do have. I've been following with attention all the interesting things that were said, and I think I have a point which brings together what Lisa and Ali said. So let me try to start by what Ali said and Ali said. And well, the point is that insofar as we have a tax stabilization agreement, and then we have to fade out some tax incentives because of the need to change the tax policy, then she mentioned that there may be either a need for transitional measures or investment arbitration. And indeed, that is also something which is very critical, because if the country doesn't do that, then the other country, the country of the investor, may anyway apply those measures. So then here's a question for Lisa. If the country of the investor is in fact levying taxes in order to compensate what falls within the stabilization agreement, so those tax incentives which have been granted, then that is a kind of unusual situation, because in a way, how can I put it? Domestically, in the investment country, so let's say the developing country in the example, there is no obligation to top up taxes, so to increase up to the minimum rates of taxes. So I have difficulties also in reconciling all this with fair and equitable treatment, because domestically, this developing country doesn't have this obligation, but across the border, there is this obligation. Then in the example made by Ali, we have the stabilization agreement. So if the country doesn't do that, then the other country will tax. And if the country does that, then there could be consequences in connection with the fact that it may lead into controversies or arbitration or situation that could undermine what had been granted before. Now, the issue is, how can we get out of this? Can we have grandfathering clauses? Can we start introducing sunset clauses? How do you see this? It's mainly a question for Lisa, but also Ali could perhaps have some comments on this, or even Hanya. And I have then another point, and I'm not sure whether this is the right moment to ask that, Agustin, or if you want me to first have the answer and then ask the second question, which is for Hanya.
Okay, let's do that. Let's hear from Lisa and Ali if they have to comment, and then we'll move to a second question. And let's try to keep it short, guys, so that we have a more dynamic setting here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll definitely keep it short. Now, I was going to also see if Howard Mann wants to come in on this as well. And I think that the intersections are extremely complicated, just because you have different treaties, different systems, different decision makers. And so I think it'll really need to be addressed at a state to state level. But the question would be, I think, in connection with the tax reform, the investment law reform, or both, likely, hopefully both. But yeah, I'd be interested to see if Howie had thought any more about how you actually address some of these issues, conflicting issues arising out of the different instruments, and then the challenges with really the different adjudicative systems that are set up under them.
But can I take your answer as acknowledging that it is a critical issue for you too?
Yes.
Okay. Shall I?
One more, Pasquale? Yes.
Yeah,
go,
I've got the second remark, and that's for, I'm not sure whether it's a question, but perhaps it's not a question to Hanya, but it's something that I particularly enjoyed. I mean, all your colleagues said many things, interesting things during the presentation, and then I want to mention one specific raised by Hanya, and that is the importance of having a clear picture on what the incentive is for, what you want to achieve, and the fact that the incentive is targeted. Now, of course, the issue is also that when the incentive is targeted, then we can have some, potential implications in some areas of the world. And here the issue is also the European Union. And in the European Union, when we have two targeted incentives, then we have the issue of state aids. But let's leave this aside, and let's say that if we have a targeted incentive and we have a clear description of what the government wants to achieve, Hanya, the question is, could it be an idea that we have some sort of international peer reviewing of the proportionality and consistency of this measure with what it wants to achieve? We have introduced in tax matters peer reviewing as to the practice of how tax authorities conduct mutual assistance. So perhaps it could be something that could also inspire the, actual effective enforcement and the validity and the ability of the incentives to achieve their goals. So I was, it's not a question about what you said, but it's a question to you just to see what your reaction would be to this proposal. Not sure whether my idea is clear.
No, thanks so much, Pasquale. That's a very interesting observation and a very interesting question or proposal. So maybe I'll address both. So I'll start with the observation around targeting. And indeed, it's kind of a fine line, right? You can't have too much targeting because that's also going to create distortions. And you can't have too little targeting like a tax holiday because it's a blanket conferral. So it's really kind of finding that fine line where you're achieving the most effectiveness, but you're not distorting competition too much. And the EU state aid rules kind of have a lot of regulations around this. But the idea is to, as much as possible, create really objective criteria that if you meet these standards, if you have these things in place, if you do these activities, then you receive the incentive. And that helps minimize distortions to competition. On the proposal, it's interesting, right? So I guess the question is who would be, I didn't quite get from you who would be peer reviewing. It's obviously complicated because it goes to that balancing act that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. Countries are competing with each other, and at the same time, they're competing with each other, but also losing out. So it's kind of a tricky, whenever we mention regional coordination or multilateral coordination in our missions and in our work, it gets positive feedback at the theoretical level, but then once we start talking about implementation, it becomes much more controversial, right? And much more thorny, if I may say that. But I will just sorry, I'll let you come in, Pasquale, but maybe this will come to your point. What has been interesting in some countries, I believe it's in like they were looking at when new measures are introduced through regional agreements. What happens is a country can mention that, and then countries can come in and comment, right? They can't say no or yes, but at least they're aware. And this was, I think, proposed in some regions in Africa, right? To like just hear about what the incentive measure is, and then they're able to comment, and then the country obviously ends up doing kind of whatever it wants to do. And that's an interesting proposal, because at least it gives kind of the space for different countries to say something and to give kind of a second eye on the incentives.
Pasquale, please, very, very short, so that we move to
Yeah,
Marlene.
it was just about who can peer review. Who can peer review? I think that if we go for GLOBE and this proposal, and there is a commitment to be acting consistently with GLOBE, then countries participating to GLOBE could also conduct, with acceptance of the other country, they could conduct a sort of peer reviewing with people just, technically making sure that what is preached is in fact also enforced. And that could be an idea. That's just to clarify, who could be peer reviewing. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks, Pasquale, and thanks, Hanya. So let's move to Marlene. She has been raising her hand. And there was also a previous question for Hanya on how important tax incentives are compared to other factors. But let's first have Marlene, and then maybe Hanya, you can answer that one that left open before.
Thank you, Augustine, and thanks to all the presenters again. I just wanted to respond to the comment that was made by Ali about why is it that tax incentives are so prevalent among developing countries in particular. I don't think I agree that it is easy. I think it is that developing countries find themselves in a position where they are capital importing. They are unable to exploit the resources that they have because they simply don't have the resources to do the exploitation. And often the investors are the ones who request the incentives. And so they do a trade-off. Usually the reason why you'd want the investment is to expand your employment, to develop the resources that you have. You don't have the capability to do that and to offer employment. And so you offer the tax incentive as a way of stimulating your economy. And it's not just investors, it's also requested by donors for overseas development assistance as well. And so I think that perhaps what developing countries need to do, who are typically the one, well, I was shocked to see that table about the US and all of those developed countries expanding their range of incentives. But I think that what countries need to do is to develop a policy, some kind of framework that guides them in terms of how they are going to structure their incentives. Okay, now we know that the minimum, that the pillar 2 in particular is going to have some impact on countries that have incentives, and the whole issue of tax sovereignty, I know, is going to be one that will probably loom over the discussions. But I believe that as I said, our experience was we had many years of sector-specific incentives discovered after about 40 years that they had not delivered on the type of development that we had anticipated. We cut them out, we structured them a little bit better, offered credits rather than no tax incentives and so on. And we have been better off in terms of the revenue. Nevertheless, it is creeping, there's a general creep. As we court M&Es, as we court investment, there is still the expectation from the investors that they will get some kind of foreign direct investment. And so I think what it requires is a stock take, certainly in countries like Jamaica. It is a stock take to look at how you approach your investment policy. What is it that you want? Sustainable development and all of that has to be brought into the mix. If you're going to get low paying jobs and at the end of that period, your persons are still not skilled they are just low paid because the skill has not been developed, then perhaps that is something that you must insist on in negotiating for these foreign direct investments, that as a part of your presence here in Jamaica, that the skill level is upgraded if you are going to be getting incentives, because ultimately that is what leads to sustainability in my view. Sorry for taking so much time.
Thanks, Marlene. No, I think it's super interesting. Let me quickly comment, Ali, and then I will give you the mic so you can follow up.
Yeah, no, just very quick. I mean, I totally agree with you, Marlene. My comment was more around corporate income tax holidays specifically, rather than tax incentives as a whole. So I think the question was, you know, why do we still see corporate income tax holidays so often, given we know that they're really not a desirable form of incentive? And that's where I was saying, I think perhaps one explanation is that a kind of blanket tax holiday has been a bit easier. You know, it's easy to promote, to advertise, investors get it, everyone gets it. Hada made a good point about there's less paperwork for investors because they don't have to file tax returns. So my comment was more specifically in terms of corporate income tax holidays, because I couldn't agree with you more that, you know, more broadly, the choice about whether or not to give incentives and how to give them is a very difficult one. And as you say, many developing countries feel that they have very few options available to them in order to get that investment to make use of their resources. But I think the only other thing I would add is opportunities for regional collaboration. I think that actually needs to be higher on the agenda as part of the global minimum tax. Is not only kind of achieving some level of global consensus, but then how do we take that down to a regional level and actually implement that in a way that will be useful in terms of developing countries kind of supporting one another to withstand pressure from investors.
But I think what Marlene just said is crucial, right? The political economy of why these tax incentives are being implemented. And Marlene, if I take your words, if I understood them correctly, developing countries just don't have the choice. They have to provide them, even sometimes knowing that they are just not effective and a windfall gain for firms, because it's the only opportunity to get that investment, right? So, and if that's a reason, that's even more worrisome, I think. Because we all know here, and we have been discussing throughout the presentations, that tax incentives in general, there are some exemptions, do not make the trick, right? And if developing countries still need to provide that, then that's something that we should be looking into, right? And I'm talking about international organizations, technical assistance. I don't know who's the player there that should take a role, but I understand the position of developing governments not having sometimes the opportunity to bargain as they should with big players there, and having to comply and rely on tax incentives. But then that might be a reason. When I ask what's the reason behind, I think that's a key factor, right? So it's very interesting to have your view from a policy making in developing countries.
Yeah, but just to say, Augustine, that developing countries should not feel victimized in the sense that you can't take the position of victim as well. You too have a responsibility. You, as a country, you do have a responsibility to outline, to develop a sustainable plan for your to attract foreign direct investment, and to ensure that you know, at the end of the day, you know, your tax base is being secured. You have that responsibility, and I think that, you know, that is the balance that I think Kanye was talking about earlier. So you know, you also have you can't just say, well, there's nothing we can do. You have to ensure that you act in a responsible manner as well.
Sure. So let me give you a round to all speakers, or 5 speakers, to close, because we are slowly getting to the end. And my teaser here would be, so we have been going through game changers in the tax niche and in the world. COVID pandemic shock is huge implication for tax revenues, for developing countries, for trade policy, and also the current discussions about services tax, digital service tax, but also the minimum corporate income taxes. So how do you really see tax, trade, and investment policy, and specifically focusing on tax incentives, in the coming year or 2 to 3 years? Do you think that this really will be a game changer, or there will be some continuity? How do you see this? Maybe Simon, if you want to kick off.
Sure, let me try. I mean, I think if you think about the post-COVID context for most governments, they're going to be trying to restore their public finances. And you would imagine then that in a perfect world, that a lot of these tax breaks and subsidies and like would come under more scrutiny. I suspect, given the lack of transparency associated with many tax breaks, that it'll be the paid subsidies which get attacked first, and then maybe the tax breaks later. So maybe this topic becomes even more important precisely because the tax breaks tend to be less transparent. And as you know, a number of the presenters have shown today, you have to do some very serious research to figure out what's actually going on. So I fear the pressures will be for less transparency and therefore for more vigilance on the part of ourselves, international organizations, the media and alike. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. Hanya, do you want to add?
Sure. So I mean, it's always hard to kind of look into the future, especially with so many kind of different variables coming into play right now. But I would say I agree a lot with Simon, right? So now countries are just focused on short-term relief efforts. But when it comes to tax breaks that some countries have introduced, those are going to push countries even further up against the wall in terms of their fiscal situation. And they're going to have to, like Marlene was saying, they're going to have to kind of take stock and revisit their incentives. And so, if we're going to put a positive spin on it, this is an opportunity to kind of really look at the incentives and streamline them and think about them in a different way. And now with these global efforts, that's also kind of helping to push this agenda forward. You mentioned this, Augustine, like tax expenditures, they're sticky. Like once you start using them, it's hard to take them back. And Marlene mentioned this as well. So now we can use this new kind of environment, both globally, as well as regionally, to kind of say, okay, we really need to revisit this. So I would say in the immediate short term, it's going to be a bit messy, probably with incentives being used for economic recovery. But a few years past that, I'm really hoping that it gives kind of a state of urgency that governments can go back, revisit their policies, and look at transitionary provisions. Like if you're going to remove a tax holiday, you can still, for example, switch to an allowance that's very generous. But even just that shift is a first move.
Thanks. Ali, any foresight on the future expectations on the mining sector and extractive sector?
Well, I mean, I think what's happening at the global level is going to have an impact on this sector like other sectors. And that's what we've been trying to communicate to our government members, is that, mining and extractives are by no means exempt, and that this provides an opportunity, kind of political cover, I think, for countries to revisit their incentives and to unwind those that are particularly harmful. So I think, it's really promising that we have some level of global consensus. There's a long way to go and details to be worked out, but I think it's very positive. And I think the thing we have to keep an eye on, though, of course, is the minimum rate, and that this doesn't become a new kind of race to the bottom, if you like. That's no longer about tax incentives as such, but rather about setting, the minimum rate becomes the cap rather than the floor, which I think is an issue, a risk for developing countries. I think we're also going to have to think a bit harder about ways to incentivize investment, governments, technical assistance providers, because insofar as incentives have been a key feature, rightly or wrongly, countries are going to have to think a bit more deeply now about how to attract investment. And hopefully that doesn't mean competing on other taxes that aren't included in the computation for the global minimum tax, which is a risk. But hopefully we can kind of get in there early and try and think of more creative, sustainable ways to make sure that it doesn't negatively impact investment in developing countries.
Thanks, Ali. Pasquale, I need that you need to rush, so very short,
Yeah,
if you're not close.
I think I agree it's time to revisit the incentives, and it's also time to limit the discretionary powers. I believe that more transparency in the way in which they're granted and a clearer policy that can be also questioned in terms of consistency with possible way forward. Right to economic development is there more important. but still only the ones which are only the incentives that are able to achieve some goals should be preserved. Sorry that I have to leave, but
No
I have
worries,
another
no.
meeting
Thanks a
starting
lot,
in 1.5
Pasquale.
minutes. It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye. Have a nice one.
Bye.
Liz, any final remarks on your side regarding treaties? How do you think that this could have an impact overall?
Yeah, just maybe quickly. I mean, I do think what's nice about this event is that shows the need for more coherence across different levels, contract, domestic law, international law, and across different spheres of international investment law and trade, as well as tax law, international tax law. So I appreciate the opportunity to have these groups together, and I think that it's important to continue to do that. And I also want to really emphasize, I think, what Ali had said about the political economy dimension of this. So that's a kind of a key part of addressing the issue of tax incentives is there's a lot of technical knowledge, but I think putting it in practice is really difficult. And governments are feeling really pressured to attract FDI. And I think that continual pressure to report on what they tracked and attract more, it creates a huge strain. So I can see why that there is this push on them to use incentives as a tool. So thanks for the initiative.
Thanks a lot. So we are really on time, 1 minute to go. So I just wanted to thank you, especially the speakers that took the time to be here today, but also all the other participants. I think it was great, very productive and informative. And don't forget that next week we'll have our closing session with a great lineup too. So very much looking forward to it. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
So much. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye bye. Thanks.